The resounding thud of my suitcase impacting the rain-slicked grass cut through the suburban quiet like a siren. "Get your trash off our property and never show your face here again!" My sister Britney shrieked from the porch, her perfectly manicured finger jabbing towards the street. Beside her, my brother Dion dangled my old, battered laptop by its screen, a triumphant, mocking laugh escaping him as if he'd just landed the ultimate punchline to a joke I wasn't privy to. I stood there, shivering in the chill evening air, gazing at the family who had unceremoniously ejected me like refuse. What they failed to grasp was that my supposedly cheap laptop held the master keys to a cybersecurity firm worth more than their combined lifetimes. Before I reveal how I transformed their callous eviction into the ultimate retribution, let me know where you're tuning in from in the comments below. Smash that like button and subscribe if you believe karma always collects its due. My name is Naomi. I am 28 years old, and I never fathomed my own kin would abandon me on a sodden lawn in the dead of night. I'd always been the family's black sheep. Growing up in our affluent Connecticut neighborhood, my parents, Richard and Eleanor, made it unequivocally clear that success was a measure of ostentatious titles and designer labels. Britney was the golden child, a real estate mogul married to a wealthy investment banker. Dion was the aspiring entrepreneur, perpetually chasing the next big tech venture with my parents' capital. And then, there was me. I wore thrift store sweaters, toiled quietly in the tech sector, and resided in a modest downtown apartment. To them, I was the underachiever, devoid of ambition. They remained oblivious to the fact that for the past 5 years I'd been meticulously building a cybersecurity firm that was discreetly dominating the market. I kept my wealth entirely concealed, valuing a tranquil, low-profile existence over the relentless competition and judgment that defined my family's interactions. The crisis ignited 3 days prior when the plumbing in my apartment building suffered a catastrophic failure. Water inundated my entire floor, rendering it uninhabitable for at least 2 weeks, while the property management navigated the extensive repairs. I could have effortlessly secured a luxury suite at a high-end hotel. However, a foolish, nostalgic impulse beckoned, presenting an opportunity for familial reconciliation. I contacted my mother, inquiring if I could temporarily occupy my old childhood bedroom until the repairs concluded. My mother demurred, citing their busy schedules, but I calmly clarified that I wasn't seeking charity. I promptly transferred $1,000 to her account, framing it as compensation for my 2-week stay. She accepted the funds instantaneously, and I packed a small duffel bag to head over. For the initial 2 days, I endured the customary barbed remarks. Britney dropped by to flaunt her new diamond bracelet, pointedly asking if I was still struggling to meet my financial obligations. Dion scoffed at my plain attire, advising me to elevate my lifestyle. I maintained a polite smile, keeping my head down and working on my laptop from a discreet corner of the living room. But tonight, everything spiraled without warning. I had stepped out for a coffee, and upon my return, discovered my belongings violently crammed into my suitcase, now lying in the mud of the front yard. "What is happening?" I inquired, ascending the driveway as the biting rain began to fall. Britney crossed her arms over her expensive cashmere cardigan. "We need you out, Naomi. Dion has important matters underway, and you are occupying space." Dion advanced, brandishing my laptop with careless abandon. "Yeah," he stated, his voice laced with condescension. "I require your old room immediately. I'm converting it into an investor pitching studio for my new startup. I can't have you lounging around looking like a vagrant while I'm seeking venture capital. You understand, right? Besides, what do you even do on this piece of junk all day? It looks like it's from the Dark Ages." I regarded him, my voice remarkably composed. "I paid Mom $1,000 to stay here for 2 weeks. I've only been here 3 days. It's freezing out here, and my apartment is still flooded." I glanced past my siblings towards my parents, who stood within the warmth of the brightly illuminated foyer. My father held his evening scotch, observing the unfolding scene with detached disinterest. My mother stood beside him, adjusting her pearl necklace. "Mom, Dad," I called out, "are you truly going to permit this? You accepted my money." My mother sighed, stepping onto the porch just enough. "Oh, Naomi, please don't be difficult. Dion is on the cusp of a significant business breakthrough. He needs the space for his studio. We will refund you the prorated amount eventually. Just call a cab and go to a motel. You're an adult. You can manage." My father took a sip of his drink and nodded in assent. "Your brother is building a real future, Naomi. We must prioritize family members who are actualizing themselves. Don't create a scene and embarrass us in front of the neighbors." The sheer callousness of their words permeated the frigid atmosphere. They were prioritizing a phantom pitching studio over their own daughter's fundamental safety and comfort. They had taken my money, utilized me as a convenient financial resource, and discarded me the moment their golden boy made a demand. Dion tossed my laptop onto the muddy suitcase. It landed with a jarring clatter. "Find a cheap hostel," he sneered, "or perhaps sleep in your car. Just get off our property." A year prior, this level of rejection would have shattered me. I would have wept, pleaded for their understanding, and internalized every cruel remark. But as I stood there in the rain, observing the smug visages of my siblings and the indifferent postures of my parents, I felt utterly devoid of emotion. No tears welled. No lump formed in my throat. The last fragile thread binding me to this family simply dissolved. I calmly retrieved my laptop, brushing away a few raindrops from its casing. I checked it for damage, a wave of relief washing over me as I found it intact. Then I pulled out my phone and accessed my ride-sharing application. I did not select the most economical option. I did not search for a budget motel. I tapped the screen and summoned an Uber-black SUV, destined for the luxurious penthouse suite I had discreetly purchased downtown 6 months prior. I stood in silence for the 4 minutes it took for the sleek black vehicle to arrive. The driver, impeccably attired, emerged and held his umbrella aloft, rushing to retrieve my muddy suitcase and place it carefully in the trunk. He held the door open for me. Britney and Dion's smug smiles faltered as they witnessed the expensive car idling in their driveway. My mother took a tentative step forward, a flicker of confusion crossing her features. I uttered not a word. I did not demand my money back or hurl insults. I simply entered the plush leather interior of the car, closed the door, and departed, leaving them standing on the porch, completely oblivious to the empire I commanded and the tempest poised to engulf their meticulously crafted lives. Exactly 1 week later, the aroma of hickory smoke and fine champagne wafted across my parents' immaculate front lawn. Britney and Dion were hosting what they boldly termed a launch and networking barbecue. In truth, it was merely a pretext to flaunt their supposed achievements to the most affluent residents of our Connecticut suburb. From the sanctuary of my new downtown penthouse, I had been monitoring the neighborhood chatter via a local community app. I was fully aware of the day's proceedings on my parents' lawn, and I was prepared to enact my next maneuver. Dion held court near the grill, loudly extolling his non-existent tech startup to anyone within earshot. He boasted about his new home studio, conveniently omitting the detail that he had unceremoniously ejected his own sister into the freezing rain to procure it. According to him, he was on the verge of securing millions in venture capital and required an environment befitting his elite mindset. Meanwhile, Britney was working the crowd with a platter of artisanal appetizers, her real estate badge gleaming proudly on her designer blouse. The primary topic of conversation among the guests, however, wasn't Dion's startup. It was the sprawling 20,000-square-foot estate directly across the street from my parents' home. For 5 years, the Harrington mansion had stood vacant, It was a modern architectural masterpiece, complete with a gated driveway, a private tennis court, and a colossal infinity pool. Its asking price was $12.5 million, a figure so exorbitant that even the affluent residents of our neighborhood considered it out of reach. Yet, 2 days prior, a sold sign had miraculously appeared on the wrought iron gates. Naturally, Britney couldn't resist inserting herself into the heart of the unfolding drama. I had quietly hired a private security contractor to discreetly monitor the street in anticipation of my arrival, and he relayed the audio directly to my earpiece. "Oh, absolutely," I overheard Britney tell Mrs. Gable, the president of the neighborhood association. "The buyer is a highly reclusive tech billionaire from the West Coast. I can't divulge too many specifics due to strict non-disclosure agreements, but let's just say I played a pivotal advisory role in the transaction. They sought the preeminent agent in the area to consult on neighborhood dynamics. It was a complete fabrication. Britney had absolutely no involvement in the sale. I knew this with irrefutable certainty because I was the one who had purchased the property. When my cybersecurity firm went public earlier that year, my net worth catapulted into the 9-figure range. I had kept the funds hidden, funneling them into discreet investments and offshore accounts while maintaining my unassuming lifestyle. But the night my family expelled me, something within me fractured. I no longer wished to remain in the shadows. I desired to erect an empire directly at their doorstep and compel them to confront it daily. The acquisition of the Harrington mansion, paid for entirely in cash, took less than 48 hours. Expediting the luxury moving company added another 2 days. The timing of their little backyard celebration was simply the perfect stage for my grand return. As the party reached its zenith, a deep, resonant rumble interrupted the mellow jazz emanating from my parents' outdoor speakers. 3 enormous, immaculately maintained moving trucks rounded the corner and began backing into the grand driveway of the Harrington estate. They bore the insignia of an exclusive white-glove relocation service catering to the ultra-wealthy. The convivial chatter at my parents' barbecue abruptly ceased. Guests gravitated towards the lawn's perimeter, their champagne flutes lowered as they gazed across the street. Britney pushed her way to the forefront, a smug, knowing smile plastered on her face as she prepared to greet her fictional billionaire client. My parents stood beside her, their expressions eager to mingle with neighborhood royalty. Dion even paused his monologue about his startup, crossing his arms to observe the spectacle. Then, a sleek, midnight black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided silently to the curb, parking precisely parallel to the mansion gates. A uniformed driver emerged, moving with practiced precision around the vehicle to open the rear passenger door. Every eye at the barbecue was fixed intently on that door. I stepped out into the afternoon sunlight. I was no longer clad in thrift store sweaters or exhibiting the weary expression they had grown accustomed to. I wore a tailored, slate-gray designer suit that cost more than my father's car, complemented by a subtle yet exceedingly expensive diamond watch. My posture was erect, my gaze cold and absolute. A collective gasp rippled through the assembly of neighbors. I witnessed my mother drop her crystal glass. It shattered on the driveway, but she didn't even flinch, her eyes bulging as she stared at me. Britney's smug smile evaporated instantly, replaced by a pallid, sickly expression of utter bewilderment. Dion's mouth hung agape, like a fish gasping for air. I offered no wave. I did not smile. I simply turned to the foreman of the moving crew, who approached with a clipboard. I signed the authorization papers with a solid gold pen, then reached into the back seat of the Rolls-Royce. I retrieved a heavy, custom-engraved bronze plaque. Walking with deliberate, confident steps to the stone pillar beside the towering iron gates, I slid the plaque into the mounting bracket the contractors had installed that morning. The sunlight caught the freshly polished metal, making the bold inscription visible all the way across the street. It read, "Naomi's Residence, Private property. I turned slowly, allowing my gaze to meet Britney's directly, her entire real estate career and social standing currently disintegrating in real time. The silence that had enveloped my parents' yard was violently shattered by the sharp, angry clatter of Britney's heels on the asphalt. She was marching across the street, her face flushed a furious crimson, her carefully constructed persona of the elegant, unbothered real estate expert completely abandoned. The neighborhood guests watched with bated breath, their expensive champagne flutes lowered as the drama unfolded directly before them. The soft jazz music drifting from my parents' backyard seemed to mock the palpable tension building in the air. "What do you think you are doing?" Britney shrieked as she reached the edge of my new driveway. Her eyes darted frantically from the polished Rolls-Royce to the gleaming bronze plaque bearing my name, her mind utterly incapable of processing the reality of the situation. "Take down that fake sign this instant, Naomi. You are trespassing on a multi-million-dollar property, and I will not stand here and let you embarrass our family by squatting in a house I am supposed to be representing." I didn't even blink. I denied her the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. Instead of dignifying her hysterical outburst with a reply, I redirected my attention to the moving crew. The foreman signaled to his team, and the heavy metal doors of the first transport truck rolled open with a loud mechanical hum. "Careful with those," I instructed the foreman, my voice calm, steady, and authoritative. "These are enterprise-grade cryptographic servers. They need to be moved directly into the climate-controlled basement facility. Ensure the anti-static mats are laid down before you roll them in." The movers began carefully offloading row after row of sleek, high-end server racks, their cooling fans and metallic casings gleaming in the afternoon sun. The equipment alone was worth more than my parents' entire retirement portfolio. This was the very backbone of my newly expanded cybersecurity firm, the same tech empire my family dismissed as a mere hobby tinkered with on a cheap laptop. These machines processed security protocols for global financial institutions, and now they were going to be housed directly across the street from the brother who had once called my work worthless. Britney scoffed loudly, stepping closer, but keeping a wary eye on the burly security contractors positioned near the gate. "Oh, I get it now," she sneered, her voice dripping with venom and desperate denial. "You found yourself some rich old sugar daddy, is that it? You're playing the part of a pathetic sugar baby, renting this mansion for the weekend just to put on a show and make us jealous. This is a new low, even for you, Naomi. How much is he paying you to rent these ridiculous computer props?" She pulled her phone from her designer purse, jabbing at the screen with aggressive force. "I'm calling the police right now. I actually know the buyer of this estate. My firm has connections with the billionaire who purchased it, and I know for a fact he didn't authorize some washed-up, jealous sister to squat on his lawn. You are going to be arrested, Naomi. They're going to haul you away in handcuffs in front of the whole neighborhood, and Mom and Dad aren't going to bail you out this time." Across the street, I could see my parents and Dion hovering at the edge of their manicured lawn. They were too cowardly to cross the street themselves, but eager to watch Britney put me in my place. Dion was smirking, clearly relishing the thought of my humiliation and arrest. My mother had her arms crossed, shaking her head in theatrical disappointment. I let Britney dial the first 2 digits of the emergency number. I allowed her that fleeting sense of control. Then, I finally acknowledged her. I reached into the leather portfolio I'd brought from the car and pulled out a thick, heavily watermarked document. It was crisp, official, and bore the unmistakable gold seal of the county clerk's office. "You can put the phone away, Britney," I said, my tone as cold and hard as the marble pillars framing my new front door. "The police are not going to arrest someone for standing on their own property." Britney froze, her thumb hovering over the screen. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, though a flicker of genuine panic finally crossed her eyes. I stepped forward and held the document up just enough for her to see the bold, capitalized print at the top. It was the master deed to the Harrington mansion, and right there, printed clearly on the ownership line, was my full legal name. "I didn't rent this house, Britney," I said slowly, trying to make my voice audible to every curious neighbor on the quiet street. "And there's no sponsor. When I heard the house was listed for $12.5 million, I wanted to be absolutely sure there wouldn't be any delays. So I completely bypassed your little real estate agency. I went directly to the seller and offered him $2.5 million in cash above the asking price, just to close the deal in 48 hours. Brittany's phone slipped from her trembling hand, hitting the paved driveway with a sharp, echoing crack. The sound of the phone shattering on the pavement seemed to break the spell that had held my parents frozen on their lawn. Seeing her precious golden child utterly speechless, my mother, Susan, finally decided to intervene. She marched across the street, her expensive heels clicking aggressively, my father, Richard, trailing closely behind her. Dion held back a few steps, his arrogant smirk completely wiped from his face. Susan pushed past the burly security guards, who immediately stepped forward to intercept her. I held up my hand, signaling the guards to stand down. I wanted the entire neighborhood, now openly eavesdropping from the edge of my parents' yard, to hear every word of this exchange. "Naomi, what on earth is going on here?" my mother demanded, her voice shrill and commanding. "Why is your sister looking like she just saw a ghost? And what is this nonsense about you buying the Harrington estate?" I calmly held out the master deed. "It's not nonsense, Mom. It's a fact. I own this property, free and clear." My father adjusted his glasses, leaning in to read the document. His face turned completely pale. Susan snatched the thick paper from my hands, her eyes scanning the legal jargon and my signature at the bottom. For a fleeting second, I thought I might actually receive an apology. I thought she might acknowledge the terrible mistake they made last week by throwing me out into the rain. Instead, her expression hardened. The gears in her head whirred as she processed my immense, hidden wealth, and she immediately calculated how it could benefit her favorite children. "Well," she began, her tone instantly shifting from angry to condescendingly practical. "This is certainly a surprise, Naomi. I had no idea you were hiding this kind of money from your own family, but honestly, this works out perfectly." I raised an eyebrow. "Perfectly for whom?" "For all of us," Susan said, waving her hand towards the massive stone facade of my new home. "You are a single woman, Naomi. You don't need 20,000 square feet and a private tennis court all to yourself. It is completely absurd and selfish. Brittany and her husband are trying to start a family soon, and they need a proper estate to raise children. And Dion desperately needs the basement facility for his tech startup. He can use those servers you just brought in. You can take the guest house in the back, and we will move the rest of the family into the main mansion. It's the only logical solution." A collective murmur of absolute disbelief rippled through the crowd of neighbors still watching from across the street. Even Mrs. Gable looked appalled by my mother's sheer audacity. "You threw me out of your house in the middle of the freezing rain just 7 days ago," I said, my voice steady and echoing clearly across the driveway. "You took my $1,000, let Dion insult me, and told me to go sleep in my car. And now you think you're going to move into my $12 million home?" "We are family," Susan snapped, stepping closer and trying to employ her old tactics of intimidation. "Family shares their blessings. You owe this to your sister. She has always had so much potential, and you've always been so difficult. You need to stop being so incredibly selfish and think about the family legacy." "Selfish?" I repeated, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh. "That's a very interesting choice of words coming from you, Mom. Tell me, did you think about the family legacy when you forged my signature 5 years ago?" Susan froze, her face draining of all color, and she took a sudden, involuntary step back. "Keep your voice down," she hissed, her eyes darting nervously toward the onlookers. I will not, I replied loudly. Let's talk about who is really selfish. When my grandfather passed away, he left an $80,000 college fund entirely in my name. I worked double shifts to pay for my own tuition because you told me the market crashed and the money was gone. It took me years to discover the truth. The market didn't crash. You illegally accessed my account, drained every single penny of my inheritance, and used it to pay for Britney's extravagant destination wedding in Italy. Britney whipped her head around to stare at our mother. What? She gasped. You told me you and Dad paid for the wedding with your investments. My father looked utterly humiliated, staring at the ground, confirming his complicity in the theft. The neighbors were now openly whispering, their horrified gazes fixed firmly on Susan. Her carefully curated image as the perfect affluent matriarch was shattering into a million irreparable pieces. That was different, Susan stammered, her voice shaking as she desperately tried to regain control of the narrative. Britney needed a wedding that reflected our social standing. You were just going to a state school. You didn't need all that money. You're right, I said smoothly. I didn't need it. I built a multi-million-dollar cybersecurity empire completely on my own while you catered to their delusions. But that doesn't mean I forgive you. And it certainly doesn't mean you're stepping one foot inside my home. I turned to my leather portfolio one last time and pulled out 3 legally binding documents, handing one to Susan, one to Richard, and dropping the last one right onto Britney's chest. These are official, notarized no trespassing orders, I announced cleanly. They apply to this entire estate, including the sidewalks bordering the property line. If any of you, including Dion, take one single step onto my land, my private security team will immediately detain you, and the local police will arrest you. I suggest you all go back to your little barbecue. We have nothing left to say to each other. The retreat of my family was a sight I will never forget. Without a single word of rebuttal, my parents and sister turned on their heels and marched back across the street, their faces burning with the kind of humiliation that wealth and status could never wash away. The neighborhood guests at their little barbecue suddenly found excuses to leave, hurrying to their cars and whispering excitedly about the scandal they had just witnessed. By sunset, the street was entirely quiet, and I was sitting in the grand living room of my new $12 million estate, listening to the comforting, low hum of the enterprise servers running securely in my basement. I knew my family would not simply let this go. When people who are obsessed with control lose their grip on you, they do not apologize. They retaliate. Since they could no longer use their parental authority or physical intimidation to bully me, they resorted to the only weapon they had left in this affluent suburb. They weaponized the neighborhood bureaucracy. 2 mornings later, I walked down my sweeping driveway to check the brass mailbox mounted on the stone pillar near my front gates. Attached to the iron bars was a thick, neon orange envelope. Inside was a stack of official citations from the local homeowners association. I flipped through the crisp pages, a dry laugh escaping my throat as I read the absurd charges. There was a fine for grass height non-compliance, claiming my front lawn was exactly 1/4 of an inch above the neighborhood standard. There was a fine for improper refuse concealment because my custom trash bins had been left outside for 10 minutes past the allowable window. But the largest penalties, taking up 3 full pages, were for unauthorized commercial vehicle presence. The HOA had cited the unmarked black transport vans used by my elite IT setup team, classifying them as industrial eyesores that disrupted the aesthetic harmony of the street. At the bottom of the final page, the penalties were tallied up. The total amount due immediately was $5,000. As I folded the papers back into the envelope, the sharp, pungent smell of a cheap cigar drifted through the iron bars of my gate. I looked across the property line. Dion was standing on the public sidewalk, just inches from my boundary, leaning casually against his leased sports car. He wore a smug, triumphant grin, puffing on his cigar and watching me read the notices. "Good morning, neighbor," Dion called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Looks like you got a little mail. You really should read the neighborhood bylaws, Naomi. This is an exclusive community. We have standards to maintain. You can't just bring your trashy habits into a place like this and expect us to look the other way." I stepped closer to the gate, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "You went to the HOA, didn't you?" He took a slow drag of his cigar and exhaled the smoke toward my property. "I didn't just go to them, Naomi. I play golf with Arthur Gable, the HOA president. His wife was at our barbecue, remember? Arthur is a very reasonable man, especially when you bring him a box of imported Cuban cigars. We had a long chat about the neighborhood property values and the disruptive element that just moved in across the street." Dion pushed himself off his car and stepped right up to the boundary line, his eyes gleaming with malicious delight. "You might have scraped up enough cash to buy this house, but you clearly don't know how the real world works. Arthur and I are going to bleed you dry. Every time a leaf falls on your driveway, you'll get a fine. Every time a delivery truck stops at your gate, you'll get a fine. We'll pile on the liens until the HOA forecloses on this ridiculous mansion and kicks you out onto the street where you belong. You can't win against us here." He stood there, chest puffed out, waiting for my reaction. He wanted me to scream at him. He wanted me to clutch the iron bars and beg him to call off his friends. He figured paying $2.5 million in cash as a house deposit had drained my bank accounts, and that a $5,000 fine would send me into financial panic. Instead, I gave him a slow, chilling smile. I didn't say a single word in response. I simply turned around and walked back up the long, manicured driveway, leaving him standing on the sidewalk with his cigar and his delusions of grandeur. I entered my home, the heavy oak doors closing silently behind me, and walked straight into my new home office. I sat down at my massive mahogany desk and opened my laptop. I navigated to the neighborhood HOA online payment portal, entered my citation numbers, and typed in my credit card information. With 3 simple clicks, the $5,000 balance was cleared. It was an amount so insignificant to my net worth that it didn't even trigger an alert on my phone. But I wasn't going to let Arthur Gable and my brother use a petty neighborhood committee to harass me. I picked up my phone and dialed the direct line to my primary wealth manager in New York. "Good morning, Naomi." His crisp voice answered on the first ring. "How is the new property?" "The house is perfect," I replied smoothly. "But I have a new acquisition target for you. I need you to look into the corporate structure of the property management company that oversees my local homeowners association. Find out who owns their parent conglomerate." There was a brief pause on the line, followed by the sound of rapid typing. "Consider it done. Are we looking to file a grievance?" "No," I said, leaning back in my leather chair and looking out the window toward my parents' house across the street. "I don't want to file a grievance. I want to buy the entire management company. I want a controlling stake by Friday." While I waited for my wealth manager in New York to execute the hostile takeover of the HOA management company, my sister was busy orchestrating her own spectacular downfall. Britney's entire identity was wrapped up in being the successful, wealthy daughter of our family. My cash purchase of the Harrington estate had completely shattered her reality. Instead of accepting defeat or reflecting on her terrible behavior, she became obsessed with proving that my money was dirty. She could not fathom a world where the sister she had mocked and thrown into the rain was legitimately more successful than she would ever be. As a licensed real estate agent, Britney had access to the multiple listing service and various proprietary financial background check databases. These powerful tools were strictly regulated, meant only for vetting legitimate clients and processing real estate transactions. But ethics had never been my sister's strong suit. Sitting in her boutique real estate office downtown, she used her professional credentials to run unauthorized, illegal searches on my social security number, my tax history, and the closing documents of my mansion. She was desperately hunting for a fraudulent loan, a shady cosigner, or any tiny discrepancy to prove that I was a complete fraud. When her illegal database searches yielded nothing but airtight, legitimate financial records, Britney decided to invent her own twisted truth. She immediately began a vicious whisper campaign throughout our exclusive neighborhood. She stood at the edge of my parents' manicured driveway, intercepting neighbors as they walked their purebred dogs or checked their mail. I watched from my second-floor window as she dramatically pointed toward my house, whispering conspiratorially to Mrs. Gable and anyone else who would listen. According to Britney, there was no cybersecurity firm. I was allegedly involved in a massive international money laundering ring. She told everyone that the enterprise-grade servers my team had carefully installed in the basement were actually being used for illegal cryptocurrency mining to clean dirty cartel money. She painted me as a dangerous, unstable criminal who had brought organized crime directly to their peaceful, affluent street. She even claimed that my quick cash purchase of the house was a classic hallmark of illicit financial activities. Her lies spread like wildfire. The affluent residents of our Connecticut suburb thrived on scandal, and Britney had served them an absolute masterpiece. Within 48 hours, the atmosphere on the street had completely shifted. When I took my morning jog, neighbors who had eagerly attended my parents' barbecue now physically crossed the street to avoid walking near me. Mothers pulled their children closer when I jogged past their lawns. The local barista at the corner cafe glared at me with visible disdain when I ordered my black coffee, aggressively slamming my cup down on the counter. I was being treated like a toxic hazard in my own community. They thought their silent judgment and icy stares would intimidate me into packing up and leaving. But they completely underestimated what I did for a living. I did not just own a highly successful cybersecurity firm, I personally engineered its core architecture. My personal financial records, public filings, and digital identity were wrapped in layers of proprietary intrusion detection software that not even the federal government could casually bypass without triggering an immediate alert. I guarded my data with the exact same military-grade protocols I sold to global banks. On Thursday evening, I was sitting in my basement command center, reviewing code updates on one of the main server terminals. The room was cool and quiet, filled only with the steady hum of cooling fans. Suddenly, a bright red notification banner flashed across my secondary monitor. It was a high-priority security alert from my personal data sentry protocol. Someone had just attempted a deep-dive query into my sealed financial history using a restricted commercial real estate database. I set down my coffee mug and pulled the security logs. The unauthorized ping was incredibly clumsy, leaving a massive digital footprint across the network. My software instantly traced the origin of the query, decrypting the routing information in a matter of seconds. The screen displayed the exact geolocation, the device MAC address, and the registered user credentials. A cold smile spread across my face as I read the output. It was an IP address registered directly to the boutique real estate brokerage where my sister worked. The user ID belonged to Britney. By using her licensed realtor account to dig into my private financial records without my consent or a legitimate business purpose, she had just committed a severe violation of the Fair Credit Reporting Act, alongside multiple federal data privacy laws. She thought she was being a clever detective, but she had just handed me the digital equivalent of a signed confession, and I was going to make sure it cost her everything. Friday evening arrived with a chilling breeze, but the temperature inside the neighborhood clubhouse was practically boiling. Dion had not wasted a single second. Fueled by Britney's fabricated rumors of money laundering and his own bruised ego, he had successfully petitioned Arthur Gable to call an emergency, mandatory homeowners association assembly. When I walked through the double oak doors of the clubhouse, the low hum of neighborhood gossip instantly died. Dozens of affluent residents turned in their folding chairs to glare at me. I took a seat in the very back row, crossing my legs and resting my leather portfolio on my lap. I wore a tailored crimson blazer, projecting absolute confidence in a room full of people who wanted to see me destroyed. At the front of the room, sitting behind a long folding table, was the HOA board. Arthur Gable sat in the center, looking incredibly self-important. To his right stood my brother. Dion cleared his throat and tapped the microphone. A smug grin was plastered across his face. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," he began, his voice dripping with fake concern. "We are here tonight to address a severe threat to our community. As many of you know, the Harrington estate was recently purchased by my sister, but she is not using it as a home. She has illegally converted the basement into an industrial server farm. She is running a massive, unregulated commercial enterprise in a strictly residential zone, consuming dangerous amounts of our local power grid, and frankly, inviting illicit criminal elements right to our doorstep." Britney sat in the front row, nodding vigorously. She turned around to make sure the neighbors saw her terrified expression. "We do not know where she got the money for this house," Britney called out, loud enough for the entire room to hear. "She was completely broke a week ago. Now she has millions of dollars in cash and unmarked transport vans showing up in the middle of the night. It is terrifying." A loud murmur of outrage swept through the room. That was when my mother, Susan, decided it was time for her performance. She stood up from her seat next to Britney, clutching a tissue to her chest. She walked slowly toward the front, her eyes downcast, playing the role of the tragic, heartbroken matriarch to absolute perfection. "Please, everyone," Susan said, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured sorrow. "This is incredibly difficult for our family. As Naomi's mother, it breaks my heart to stand here today. We tried to raise her with the right values. We gave her a loving home, we supported her, and we even offered her a place to stay just last week when she was struggling. But she has lost her way. She has become entangled in things we simply do not understand, and her reckless actions are now endangering all of our families. We love her, but we must protect our community first." The room erupted into sympathetic applause for my mother. Several neighbors glared back at me with absolute disgust. Mrs. Gable actually walked over and patted my mother on the shoulder, offering her quiet words of comfort. It was a masterclass in manipulation. My family was publicly humiliating me, branding me a criminal, and painting themselves as the noble victims who were forced to make a difficult sacrifice for the greater good of the neighborhood. They were entirely convinced that this public shaming would break my spirit and force me to abandon my property in disgrace. Arthur Gable banged a small wooden gavel against the table, calling the room back to order. "The HOA board has reviewed the evidence presented by Dion and Britney," Arthur announced, his voice booming through the speakers. "The presence of commercial-grade servers and enterprise IT infrastructure is a direct and undeniable violation of Section 4 of our community bylaws. Furthermore, the suspicious nature of the funding used to purchase the property warrants a full investigation. Therefore, the board has voted unanimously. We are issuing an immediate cease and desist order for all commercial operations on the Harrington estate. Furthermore, we are filing an emergency injunction to forcefully evict you from the premises." Arthur leaned forward over the folding table, pointing a stubby finger directly at me. "You have 30 days to vacate the neighborhood, Naomi," he demanded loudly. "If you refuse, we will levy a $10,000 fine for every day you remain, and we will involve the federal authorities to look into your shady finances." The entire room fell dead silent. Every single pair of eyes was locked onto me, waiting for me to panic, to cry, or to beg for mercy. My parents looked incredibly satisfied. Dion crossed his arms, practically vibrating with triumph. Instead of arguing, I simply offered Arthur a bright, chilling smile. I slowly lifted my left wrist, pulling back the sleeve of my crimson blazer, and checked the time on my diamond watch. Right on the hour, The heavy oak doors at the back of the clubhouse swung open with a loud thud that echoed across the silent room. A tall, impeccably dressed man in a sharp navy suit strode confidently down the center aisle. He carried a sleek leather briefcase and possessed the kind of intimidating, unbothered aura that only high-powered corporate attorneys have. This was Marcus Sterling, my lead corporate counsel, who had just flown in directly from New York. Arthur Gable slammed his wooden gavel onto the folding table, his face turning a blotchy shade of purple. "Excuse me," Arthur barked, standing up and pointing a trembling finger at Marcus. "This is a closed private assembly for residents only. Security, remove this man from the premises immediately." Marcus did not even break his stride. He walked straight past the front row, completely ignoring Britney's bewildered stare and my mother's sudden, dramatic gasp. He approached the folding table, snapped his briefcase open with a sharp click, and dropped a thick, heavy stack of legally bound documents directly on top of Arthur's handwritten meeting notes. "I do not think you have the authority to remove anyone," Mr. Gable said smoothly, his voice projecting effortlessly across the room without needing a microphone. "My name is Marcus Sterling. I represent Vanguard Financial Partners. As of 4 this afternoon, my client has successfully executed a hostile takeover and acquired a controlling 51% stake in Sterling Property Solutions, the parent management conglomerate that oversees this specific homeowners association." The room fell into a stunned, breathless silence, Dion's jaw practically unhinged. He looked frantically from Marcus to the thick stack of legal documents, and then slowly his eyes locked onto me. I stood up from my chair in the back row, smoothly adjusting the lapels of my crimson blazer. I walked at a deliberate, unhurried pace down the center aisle, feeling the weight of dozens of stares shifting from the attorney to me. I stopped right next to Marcus, facing the completely paralyzed HOA board. "You see, Arthur," I said, my voice calm, but laced with absolute cutting authority. "When my brother tried to use this little neighborhood committee to bully me out of my own home, I realized I had two distinct options. I could file a tedious legal injunction, or I could simply buy the company that signs your checks. I chose the latter. I am now the majority shareholder of the management group that employs you. I own this HOA." Arthur swallowed hard, a visible bead of sweat forming on his receding hairline. "You cannot do this," he stammered, his false bravado entirely evaporating under the harsh fluorescent lights. "This is a community board. We are elected by the residents. You cannot just buy a neighborhood." "I can buy the management company that governs it," I corrected him sharply, my tone leaving zero room for debate. And I did. And as the new majority stakeholder, my very first official act is initiating a comprehensive audit of all board activities, starting with the blatant, pathetic corruption sitting right in front of me. Marcus reached into his tailored suit pocket, pulled out a small silver flash drive, and calmly plugged it into the laptop connected to the clubhouse projector. He tapped a few keys, and the massive white screen behind the board members suddenly flared to life. A collective gasp ripped through the crowd of affluent neighbors. Displayed in massive, high-definition resolution on the projector screen was a series of digital photographs and text message screenshots. My elite cybersecurity software had easily pulled the unencrypted communications directly from Dion's phone when he carelessly connected to my guest Wi-Fi network earlier that week. The first image clearly showed Dion handing Arthur a luxury humidor of imported Cuban cigars in the country club parking lot. The next slide displayed a direct text message from Dion to Arthur that read, "I need her out. Hit her with every fine in the book, and I will cover your golf club dues for the next 3 years. Make her life miserable." Arthur's reply was right underneath it, clear as day, saying, "Consider it done. The eviction notice goes out Friday." The neighbors, who had been ready to run me out of town just 5 minutes ago, instantly turned their fierce outrage toward the front of the room. Shouts of anger and absolute disgust erupted from the folding chairs. Mrs. Gable stood up, looking entirely mortified by her husband's very public exposure. My parents sank lower into their seats, their faces pale with shock, as they realized their golden boy had just been outed as a bribing fraud. "Arthur, your position as HOA president is immediately terminated," I announced, my voice cutting cleanly through the growing chaos in the room. "You are fired. Furthermore, my legal team will be forwarding these exact files to the State Attorney General for a formal investigation into corporate bribery and extortion. You used your official position to harass a resident in exchange for luxury goods and financial favors. You are going to lose a lot more than just your little wooden gavel." Arthur collapsed back into his folding chair, his face buried in his hands. Dion looked like he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. Britney and my parents were completely frozen, trapped in the front row as the entire neighborhood turned against them. I turned my attention to the microphone on the table, leaning in so the entire room could hear my next words perfectly clearly. "Now, let us discuss the fate of my family." The silence in the clubhouse was absolute as my words hung in the air. I did not wait for my parents to formulate an excuse, or for Britney to start another hysterical crying fit. I simply turned around and walked down the center aisle, my corporate attorney matching my pace. The sea of affluent neighbors parted for me, their faces a mixture of awe and terror. I walked out into the cool evening breeze, leaving my family to face the wrath of the community they had tried to turn against me. For the next 3 days, my phone was blissfully quiet. The neighborhood was entirely peaceful. There were no more neon orange envelopes taped to my gates. There were no more whispers when I took my morning jog. The HOA board was completely dissolved, and my legal team was busy restructuring the management company to my exact specifications. I assumed my family was hiding inside their house across the street, too ashamed to show their faces, but I underestimated their greed. When brute force and public humiliation failed, they resorted to their oldest and most effective tactic: emotional manipulation. On Tuesday afternoon, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed my mother's name. I let it ring 3 times before pressing accept, curious to hear what kind of narrative she had spun to justify her actions. "Naomi, darling." Susan's voice floated through the speaker. It was thick with artificial sweetness, completely devoid of the venom she had spewed at the clubhouse just days prior. I did not respond. I just let her talk into the silence. "Listen, sweetheart," she continued, her tone shifting to sound heartbroken and reflective. "Your father and I have done a lot of soul-searching over the past few days. Things got so out of hand, and emotions were running incredibly high. We forgot what truly matters. We are family, Naomi. Family fights. But at the end of the day, blood is thicker than water. We want to make things right. We want to apologize properly. Please come over for dinner tonight. Just the 4 of us. No neighbors, no drama, just a chance to heal." I stared out the massive window of my home office, looking across the street at their perfectly manicured lawn. I knew exactly what this was. Susan never apologized unless she wanted something. When I was 17, she gave me a heartfelt apology for missing my science fair, right before asking me to give up my weekend to write Britney's college admissions essay. The pattern was etched into my brain. They had finally realized that my wealth was real, that my power in this neighborhood was absolute, and that their only path to that money was through fake reconciliation. I could have said no. I could have blocked her number and never spoken to them again. But a dark, satisfying curiosity took over. I wanted to see exactly how far they were willing to push this charade. "I will be there at 7, I said, and ended the call before she could fake another sweet sentiment. At exactly 7 I walked across the street. I wore a simple black dress, leaving the designer accessories at home. I wanted them to focus entirely on the conversation. My father opened the door before I even knocked, offering a stiff, incredibly awkward smile. He ushered me into the formal dining room, where the table was set with their best china and crystal glasses. Susan rushed over, trying to pull me into a hug, but I took a step back, letting her arms fall uselessly to her sides. She recovered quickly, forcing a bright smile and gesturing for me to sit at the head of the table. But the most surprising detail was not the extravagant meal or the fake smiles. It was the person sitting at the opposite end of the long mahogany table. Dion. He was not wearing his usual casual clothes. He was dressed in a sharp, tailored suit that looked brand new. His hair was slicked back, and he looked entirely too eager. Sitting directly in front of him on the lace tablecloth was a thick, glossy, professionally bound folder. "I thought this was just the four of us," I said, looking directly at my mother. "I distinctly remember you saying no drama." Dion stood up quickly, raising his hands in a gesture of peace. "Naomi, please," he said, using a smooth, practiced voice that made my skin crawl. "Mom is right. We let things get totally out of hand. I was stressed. You were stressed. And we handled it terribly. I am here to personally apologize. I respect you, Naomi. I really do. You built an incredible empire, and I should have recognized that." He picked up the heavy, glossy folder and walked over to my side of the table. He slid it carefully across the polished wood until it rested right next to my dinner plate. The cover page featured a sleek, minimalist logo for a tech startup I had never heard of. I looked down at the folder, then back up at my brother. "What is this, Dion?" "This is the future," he said, his eyes practically gleaming with greed. "I know we've had our differences, but we are both brilliant minds in the tech space. You have the capital, and I have the vision. This is the prospectus for my new venture. I have the entire business model mapped out. All I need is the initial seed funding to get the servers running and hire a dedicated development team." My father leaned forward, nodding enthusiastically. "It's a brilliant concept, Naomi. Your brother has really outdone himself this time." Susan placed a hand over her heart. "We are so incredibly proud of both of you. Imagine what you could accomplish if you combined your resources. This is how we heal, Naomi, by building a legacy together." I kept my hands folded carefully in my lap. I did not even touch the glossy folder. "And how much seed funding are you looking for, Dion?" He puffed out his chest, completely oblivious to the trap he was walking into. $500,000 for a 20% stake in the company. It's a steal, honestly. And frankly, considering everything we have been through, investing in your brother's future is the right thing to do. It is your duty as family to help me get this off the ground." I looked at the three of them, their eyes wide with expectation, completely convinced that their ridiculous dinner had worked. They genuinely believed I was going to hand over $500,000 to the brother who had thrown my laptop in the mud. I slowly reached out and placed my hand on top of the prospectus. The glossy cover felt slick beneath my fingers. I did not open it to admire his grand vision. I opened it to dissect his delusion. I flipped past the colorful, overly designed title page and went straight for the technical architecture and compliance sections. It only took me 2 minutes of scanning the executive summary and the data flow charts to realize exactly what I was looking at. Dion sat back in his chair with a smug, expectant grin, waiting for me to pull out my checkbook and hand over a fortune. Instead, I let out a sharp, genuine laugh. "This is a joke, right?" I asked, dropping the folder back onto the lace tablecloth. Dion's confident smile faltered instantly. "Excuse me?" he said, his tone turning defensive. I leaned forward, tapping my manicured nail directly against his open pages. "You are asking for $500,000 to build an application that already exists, Dion. This entire user interface and the core functionality is a blatant, poorly disguised copy of a productivity app that launched 3 years ago. You did not innovate anything. You just changed the color scheme from blue to neon green and renamed the tabs. I continued flipping to page 12 and pointing at a complex diagram. But that is not even the worst part. Look at your data processing framework. You have structured this software to intentionally bypass standard user consent protocols and secretly scrape background location and financial data from the user's phone. That is not a clever monetization strategy, Dion. That is a massive, highly illegal data mining loophole. I looked up at him, my eyes hard. If you actually launched this garbage, not only would you be sued into oblivion for intellectual property theft, but the Federal Trade Commission would shut you down and hit you with criminal charges within a month. This is not a business plan. It is a one-way ticket to federal prison. The dining room fell completely, suffocatingly silent. Susan's fake, loving smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer panic. Dion's face turned a violent, blotchy shade of crimson. He snatched the prospectus out from under my hand, clutching it to his chest like a wounded child. "You have absolutely no idea what you are talking about," he spat, his voice trembling with pure, unadulterated rage. "You think because you got lucky and scammed your way into some tech money that you are suddenly a Silicon Valley oracle. You are nothing but a glorified IT help desk worker who stumbled onto a decent software code. You do not understand market disruption. You do not understand scaling." Before I could even respond to his pathetic insult, my father slammed his hand flat against the mahogany table, making the fine crystal glasses rattle. "That is enough, Naomi," Richard barked, his face tight with furious indignation. "How dare you sit at our table, eat our food, and speak to your brother that way? We invited you over here to make peace, and the very first thing you do is try to destroy his dreams out of pure, petty jealousy." "Jealousy?" I repeated, raising an eyebrow at my father's absolute delusion. "I am trying to keep him from getting indicted." "Dion is a visionary," Richard shouted, completely ignoring my warning. "He sees the big picture, the market potential, the incredible things that narrow-minded, cynical people like you simply cannot comprehend." He glared at me. "You got lucky, Naomi. Pure blind luck. That is the only reason you have that house across the street. Dion is actually building something from the ground up with his own intellect, and you are just too bitter and selfish to support him. You have always been like this, always trying to tear your siblings down to make yourself feel important. If you cannot see the absolute genius in your brother's work, then keep your money. He does not need it anyway." Dion stood up so fast that his heavy dining chair tipped backward and crashed loudly onto the hardwood floor. He was breathing heavily, his eyes locked onto mine with a look of absolute, unhinged hatred. "Dad is right," Dion sneered, his voice echoing sharply in the large, formal dining room. "I do not need your pity money, and I certainly do not need a washed-up IT worker telling me how to innovate in the modern tech space. You had your chance to get in on the ground floor of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise, and you blew it." He shoved his ruined prospectus into his expensive leather briefcase and snapped the brass lock shut with a sharp click. "I have a meeting next Thursday with one of the most exclusive, massive venture capital firms on the entire East Coast," Dion bragged, his chest puffed out with arrogant pride. "They operate completely anonymously because they only deal with elite, high-tier innovators. They have already reviewed my preliminary pitch, and they are practically begging to fund my entire seed round. When I walk out of their high-rise office with a $10 million check, do not come crawling back to me asking for a piece of the pie." Dion turned his back on me, marching out of the dining room and slamming the heavy front door behind him so hard that the living room windows rattled in their frames. I sat quietly at the table, looking at my parents' furious, judgmental faces, fighting the overwhelming urge to smile. What Dion did not know was exactly who owned that anonymous venture capital firm. I watched the entire disaster unfold from the massive bay windows of my second-floor home office. Dion was convinced that to secure a massive check from an elite venture capital firm, he had to walk into their boardroom looking like he was already a billionaire. He fully embraced the fake it until you make it mentality, completely ignoring the fundamental reality that actual wealthy investors can spot a desperate fraud from a mile away. By Monday morning, a bright orange rented Lamborghini Aventador was parked squarely in my parents' driveway. Dion had completely drained his personal bank accounts and convinced Britney to empty her own emergency savings just to cover the exorbitant weekly rental fee and the massive insurance deposit. He parked the blindingly bright vehicle diagonally across the concrete, ensuring it caught the sunlight and commanded attention from anyone driving past. He strutted around the neighborhood in a brand-new, custom-tailored Italian suit, aggressively revving the engine of the rented sports car. Every time he saw me standing near my windows, he thought he was intimidating me. In reality, I was taking mental notes on exactly how much crippling debt they were eagerly accumulating. But a rented luxury car and a nice suit were not enough to secure venture capital. Dion needed a working digital prototype of his application to present at the pitch meeting. Hiring a freelance development team on a rush order required immediate massive amounts of liquid cash. Since Dion and Britney had already squandered their available assets on outward appearances, they turned their predatory sights on the only people left who would blindly fund their delusions: our parents. Through the neighborhood gossip mill and the frantic phone calls my mother made to local contractors to abruptly cancel her kitchen renovations, the truth quickly became obvious. Britney, using her real estate license and her supposed expertise in market trends, had sat our parents down at the formal dining room table and pressured them into taking out a massive second mortgage on their home. She spun a beautiful, convincing lie. She promised Richard and Susan that Apex Capital, the legendary East Coast firm Dion was pitching to, was guaranteed to fund his startup. She swore that within a month, Dion would use his multi-million-dollar advance to pay off the second mortgage, buy them a vacation home in the Hamptons, and finally prove to the world that he was the true genius of the family. Driven by their desperate need to validate their golden boy and their lingering humiliation from the clubhouse incident, my parents agreed. They signed away the equity they had spent 30 years building, handing over hundreds of thousands of dollars to Dion so he could pay a cheap offshore coding farm to slap together a barely functional prototype of his stolen application idea. They were practically radiating smug satisfaction, absolutely certain that their financial gamble was about to elevate them to a level of wealth that would dwarf my cybersecurity empire. They had no idea they were walking blindly into a trap I had carefully set years ago. On Wednesday afternoon, exactly 24 hours before Dion's life-changing meeting, I was sitting at my mahogany desk, sipping a cup of black tea. My secure corporate terminal chimed with a high-priority encrypted email notification. I set my teacup down and unlocked the screen. The email was from the managing director of Apex Capital, forwarding a final meeting agenda and an attached digital portfolio for my ultimate approval. When my cybersecurity firm first went public and my net worth exploded, I did not just let my money sit dormant in offshore bank accounts. I diversified. I created Apex Capital, a highly exclusive private venture firm dedicated to funding next-generation tech infrastructure. Apex Capital was known in the industry as a kingmaker. Securing a meeting with them was nearly impossible, and getting a term sheet meant instant industry credibility. Because I valued my privacy and wanted to avoid the exhausting spotlight of the financial press, I structured the firm using multiple shell corporations and strict non-disclosure agreements. On paper, Apex Capital was run by a board of senior directors. In reality, I was the sole owner and the shadow CEO. Not a single dollar of funding was ever approved without my direct authorization. I clicked on the attachment. The file opened to reveal the exact same glossy, poorly designed pitch deck Dion had tried to hand me at the dinner table. I scrolled through the files, my eyes scanning the bloated financial projections and the highly illegal data mining frameworks he was still trying to pass off as innovation. He was walking into my firm asking my employees for $10 million of my money, using a prototype funded by the second mortgage on my parents' house. I picked up my secure phone and dialed my managing director. "Good afternoon, Naomi," he answered promptly. "I sent over the final files for tomorrow's pitch. The founder is incredibly aggressive and somewhat arrogant, but we are prepared to hear him out." "I want you to change the location of the meeting," I instructed smoothly, my eyes fixed on the rented Lamborghini across the street. "Do not use the standard conference room. Book the executive glass boardroom on the top floor, and tell security to clear my private elevator. I will be attending this pitch in person." Thursday morning arrived with crisp, clear skies. From the tinted windows of my private executive office on the top floor of the Apex Capitol building, I watched Dion pull his rented orange Lamborghini into the VIP visitor parking spot. He stepped out, adjusting the lapels of his custom Italian suit, looking every bit the arrogant visionary he desperately wanted to be. He was completely unaware that he was walking directly into the lion's den. My managing director greeted him in the lobby and escorted him to the executive glass boardroom. True to our firm's famous anonymity protocols, Dion was left alone in the massive soundproof room. At the far end of the long mahogany table was a wall-sized telepresence screen. I was sitting just 2 doors down in my secure control center, logging into the secure video conference system. I kept my camera turned off, displaying only the sleek silver logo of Apex Capital on his screen. I activated the high-grade voice modulation software I used for these anonymous investor meetings. It lowered my pitch and stripped away any recognizable cadence, projecting a deep, authoritative, and entirely gender-neutral tone into the boardroom. "Welcome to Apex Capital, Dion." My modulated voice echoed smoothly through the boardroom's surround sound speakers. "We have reviewed your preliminary pitch deck. The floor is yours." Dion stood up, practically vibrating with nervous excitement. He flashed a polished, practiced smile at the screen and launched into his presentation. For the first 10 minutes, he paced around the boardroom, spinning a web of absolute lies. He confidently claimed that his application already had 50,000 active beta testers. He pointed to fabricated charts boasting about a projected first-quarter revenue of $2.5 million. He spoke passionately about market disruption and his unique genius, taking full credit for a software architecture that I knew for a fact he had purchased from a cheap offshore coding farm using our parents' second mortgage. When he finally paused to take a breath, expecting praise, I leaned into my microphone. "Those are impressive user acquisition metrics," I stated coldly. "Let us move past the marketing pitch and discuss the actual engineering. Since you claim to be the sole architect of this platform, please explain the specific cryptographic hashing algorithm you are utilizing to secure the back-end database against external intrusion." Dion froze. The confident smile melted off his face. He blinked at the blank screen, his mind clearly racing to find a buzzword he had heard on a tech podcast. "Well," he stammered, pulling at his collar, "we utilize a highly robust cloud-based blockchain infrastructure to ensure maximum synergy across all data points." "That does not answer the question," I replied instantly, cutting him off. "Blockchain is a ledger system, not a hashing protocol. Furthermore, looking at page 12 of your technical schematic, your API endpoints are completely exposed. How exactly are you handling the latency in the encryption handshake when routing background location data through third-party servers?" Dion stared at the screen like a deer caught in headlights. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. He reached for his glass of water with a trembling hand, taking a desperate sip. "It is a proprietary method," he finally managed to say, his voice cracking slightly. "We are keeping the exact code under wraps until the funding clears to protect our intellectual property." "You are attempting to mask illegal data mining as proprietary innovation," I countered ruthlessly. "Your data routing protocol intentionally bypasses standard user consent frameworks. It is a glaring compliance violation. Your technical foundation is entirely unstable, and frankly, it appears you lack even a fundamental understanding of basic software architecture. I watched through the camera feed as Dion physically withered. His face turned pale, and sweat beaded on his forehead. The expensive Italian suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big for him. He realized in real time that his fake it until you make it strategy had catastrophically failed. He was standing in front of what he believed was a billionaire investor, and he had just been exposed as a complete fraud. He lowered his head, waiting for me to disconnect the call and throw him out of the building. But I was not going to let him go that easily. I needed him to commit his financial lies to a legally binding federal record. However, I said, allowing the modulated voice to soften just a fraction. At Apex Capital, we do not just invest in perfect code. We invest in the raw ambition of the founder. Software can be rewritten. Engineers can be hired. Your vision for market capture is aggressive, and we appreciate aggressive founders. Dion's head snapped up, his eyes widening with desperate hope. You do? He asked breathlessly. Yes, I replied smoothly. We are willing to move forward to the formal due diligence phase for a $10 million seed investment, but because your technical framework requires a complete overhaul, we must meticulously verify your current financial standing before issuing a term sheet. I require comprehensive certified financial records for your entire operation. I need your personal bank statements, the tax returns of any cosigners or initial seed investors, and the official loan origination documents for the capital you used to build this prototype. I paused, letting the weight of the demand settle over him. Upload these documents to our secure portal by tomorrow afternoon. If the funds are verified and everything aligns with the revenue claims you made today, we will fund your company. Dion was nodding so fast he looked like a bobblehead. Absolutely, he practically shouted, a massive grin returning to his face. I will have every single bank statement and mortgage document uploaded by tomorrow morning. Thank you. You will not regret this. I muted my microphone and sat back in my words to a registered financial institution to secure a multi-million-dollar investment. Dion was not just lying to his family anymore. He was formally committing wire fraud, and he was about to hand me all the evidence I needed to destroy him. Dion left the Apex Capital building, riding a high of pure adrenaline. But by the time he parked his rented Lamborghini back in our parents' driveway, the crushing reality of the investor demands finally set in. He had promised comprehensive certified financial records by tomorrow afternoon. The problem was his personal bank accounts were overdrawn, his credit cards were completely maxed out, and his fake tech company had absolutely zero revenue. But Dion was far too arrogant to back down and admit defeat. Sitting at his cheap desk in the basement, he stole from me. He opened a PDF editor and began meticulously doctoring his bank statements. He added extra zeros, fabricated massive wire transfers from non-existent beta testers, and forged official tax documents. By deciding to upload these falsified records across state lines to a registered financial institution's secure portal, Dion officially crossed the line from a pathetic liar to a federal criminal committing wire fraud. But fake bank statements weren't enough to justify a $10 million valuation for a high-end firm. He knew he needed a real, verifiable asset to prove he was a stable founder with serious backing. That evening, he cornered our parents in their living room. I watched the entire operation through secure CCTV cameras. Dion paced the room, frantically explaining how Apex Capital was willing to transfer the $10 million, but they needed to see physical collateral on his personal balance sheet. He convinced Richard and Susan it was just a temporary legal formality. He needed them to sign over the deeds to their house, transferring full ownership to him for just a few weeks until he secured major financing. Blinded by their absolute faith in their golden boy and the glittering promise of a multi-million-dollar payout, my parents eagerly agreed. First thing Friday morning, they drove to a local notary public and legally signed away the only asset they had left. The house they had lived in for 30 years was now entirely Dion's property. The financial strain of funding Dion's charade had completely bled them dry. The cash from their second mortgage was gone, squandered on the offshore coating farm, and Britney's desperate attempts to maintain their wealthy neighborhood facade. Their checking accounts were empty, and their premium credit cards were declining at the local grocery store. On Saturday afternoon, while Dion was out parading his rented sports car around town, I saw a figure hurrying up my long, manicured driveway. It was my mother, Susan. She kept her head down, wearing a large sun hat and oversized sunglasses, terrified that the neighbors might see her crawling to the daughter she had publicly disowned just a week prior. I opened my heavy front door before she could even ring the bell. Susan jumped, her hand flying to her chest in surprise. She looked exhausted, the severe stress of their financial ruin finally showing through her expensive makeup. "Naomi," she began, her voice tight, anxious, and stripped of its usual commanding tone. "I need a favor, just a small temporary loan. Your father and I have tied up all our liquid assets in Dion's venture, and there has been a slight delay with our credit card payments. I need you to clear our platinum card balance. It is only $25,000. You will get it back the second Dion's funding clears next week. You owe us this much after the embarrassment you caused at the clubhouse." I leaned against the door frame, staring coldly at the woman who had stolen my college fund and thrown me out into the freezing rain. "You gave Dion all your cash," I stated flatly. "And yesterday morning, you signed over the deed to your house. You are completely broke, Mom." Susan's eyes widened in genuine shock. "How do you know about the deed?" she demanded, her tone instantly shifting from pleading back to defensive. "It's public county record," I lied smoothly, keeping my expression entirely neutral. "You do not understand high-level business," Susan snapped, crossing her arms defensively over her chest. "It is collateral. Dion is securing a $10 million investment from Apex Capital. We're going to Baricherthan, you could ever imagine. 25,000 is pocket change to us now. Stop being so petty. Remember your family legacy and write the check." "I am not giving you a single dime," I said, my voice dropping to a cold, hard whisper. "And you need to listen to me very carefully. Dion is not a visionary, he is a fraud. The files he submitted to those investors are entirely fabricated. He is going to bankrupt this family, and when it all crashes down, he is the sole legal owner of the house you are currently sleeping in. He is going to lose everything, and he is taking you and Dad down with him." Susan's face twisted with pure, ugly rage. She refused to accept the undeniable truth. She refused to believe she had sacrificed her entire life for a son who was actively destroying them. "You are just a bitter, jealous little girl," Susan hissed, her voice trembling with fury. "You cannot stand the thought of your brother being more successful than you." Instead of walking away with whatever dignity she had left, Susan leaned forward and spat directly onto the polished stone of my pristine front porch. She turned on her heel and marched angrily back down the driveway, completely oblivious to the fact that she had just sealed her own fate. The dried spit on my pristine stone porch was a pathetic reminder of my family's rapid unraveling. I had my housekeeper wash it away the next morning, but the absolute desperation radiating from across the street was impossible to ignore. Britney was feeling the financial squeeze the most. She had foolishly emptied her emergency savings and joint accounts to fund Dion's rented Lamborghini and his fake tech prototype. Her husband, who was previously unaware of just how much money she had handed over to her brother, was now furious. Britney desperately needed a massive six-figure commission check to save her marriage and keep her own lifestyle from collapsing entirely. Opportunity seemed to knock for her when the Miller house, located just 2 doors down from my estate, went on the market. It was a beautiful, sprawling property. But Britney, driven by financial panic and pure avarice, opted for a dirty tactic. She artificially inflated the asking price to secure a larger commission by drastically altering the listing details. In the official brochure, she added 800 square feet of non-existent living space, misrepresenting an unfinished, unpermitted basement as a luxury finished area. What Britney failed to grasp was my deep involvement in the Miller House sale. David, a top executive director at my cybersecurity firm and a brilliant engineer, was relocating from the West Coast. I had personally offered to help him find a property in my neighborhood. Furthermore, having completed my corporate takeover of the local HOA management company, I had unrestricted access to the precise, legally verified blueprints and zoning permits for every home on the street. On Tuesday afternoon, David arrived to tour the house. I accompanied him, acting as his local advisor. As we approached the paved driveway, Britney stood by the front door, adjusting her designer blazer and feigning a welcoming smile. That smile vanished the instant she saw me with her affluent prospective buyer. Inside the foyer, Britney immediately launched into her desperate, fast-paced sales pitch. She handed David a glossy, high-resolution brochure, aggressively highlighting the purported square footage. She attempted to rush us through the main floor, loudly praising the crown molding and natural light, clearly intending to avoid the basement. However, I interrupted her in the middle of the living room. "Britney," I stated, my voice sharp and resonant against the hardwood floors. "You've listed this property at 4,200 square feet, but county tax records and HOA master blueprints clearly indicate only 3,400. Are you illegally including the raw basement in this calculation?" Britney flushed a deep, angry red, her eyes darting nervously to David. "The cellar has been fully prepped for finishing," she stammered, her professional veneer cracking. "It's entirely usable space, Naomi. You don't understand luxury market real estate appraisals." "I understand precisely what unpermitted space is," I replied smoothly, crossing my arms. "And I know for a fact the Millers never obtained a permit to finish that basement. You are artificially inflating the listing price by nearly $500,000 based on phantom square footage. If my client purchases this house at your quoted price, the bank appraisal will fail catastrophically, and he'll be ensnared in a fraudulent contract." David immediately returned the glossy brochure to Britney, his expression hardening. "I'm not interested in doing business with a dishonest agent," he stated firmly. He turned and walked out the front door without another word. Britney completely lost control. She chased us onto the front lawn, abandoning all professional composure. "You vindictive witch!" she shrieked, her voice shrill, echoing down the quiet suburban street. She threw her hands in the air, her face contorted in a massive, ugly tantrum. "You're ruining my life. I needed this commission. I gave Dion everything. And now you're actively sabotaging my career because you're a jealous, spiteful loser. You just can't stand to see me succeed." Neighbors began to peer from behind their curtains. I stood motionless on the sidewalk, letting her scream herself hoarse. When she finally paused to catch her breath, panting heavily in the afternoon sun, I looked her directly in the eye. "I am not sabotaging your career, Britney," I said, my tone ice-cold and utterly devoid of pity. "You destroyed it yourself. And since we're discussing your professional conduct, I have one more piece of news." I reached into my leather tote bag and produced a thick, sealed envelope. The official crest of the State Real Estate Commission was clearly printed in the top left corner. "This went out in the morning mail," I announced, ensuring my voice carried across the lawn. "It's a formal, legally backed complaint detailing your fraudulent listing tactics today. More importantly, it includes the IP address logs and digital timestamps proving you illegally accessed the multiple listing service database to conduct an unauthorized background check on my private finances." 2 weeks prior, Britney's mouth fell open, the remaining color draining rapidly from her face as the reality of her actions sunk in. You violated the Fair Credit Reporting Act and severe state ethical guidelines, I stated cleanly, dropping the copy of the complaint at her feet. They are going to permanently revoke your license, Britney. Your career is officially over. The crisp, biting chill of late November settled over our neighborhood, signaling the arrival of Thanksgiving week. The festive season typically meant elaborate decorations and cheerful gatherings, but the atmosphere across the street was suffocatingly bleak. Neighborhood gossip had reached a fever pitch following Britney's public meltdown on the lawn. The State Real Estate Commission had acted swiftly on my formal complaint, officially suspending her license pending a full investigation into her fraudulent MLS activities. She was effectively unemployed and utterly disgraced. Meanwhile, Dion was spiraling into sheer panic. He had uploaded his forged bank statements to the Apex Capital Secure portal, and the crushing anxiety of awaiting a response from the fictional investors was consuming him. They were out of money, out of time, and out of options. That was when the heavy cream envelope appeared in my brass mailbox. I opened it in the quiet sanctuary of my home office. Inside was a handwritten letter from my father, Richard. The penmanship was carefully crafted to convey deep emotion and sincerity. He wrote about the spirit of the holidays and how the Thanksgiving season had prompted him to reflect on our family's fractured dynamics. He claimed that he and Susan had stayed awake for nights, agonizing over the terrible mistakes they had made. The letter was a masterpiece of emotional manipulation, culminating in a desperate plea for me to join them for a traditional Thanksgiving dinner. He promised no arguments, no tension, and no business talk, just a family breaking bread and attempting to heal. I read the letter twice, letting out a sharp, humorless laugh. I didn't need to guess their true intentions. My corporate intelligence team had already uncovered their latest scheme. 3 days prior, Dion and Richard had discreetly visited a strip mall office in a neighboring town to hire a man named Vance. Vance was a sleazy, desperate attorney with a notorious reputation for assisting greedy relatives in exploiting legal loopholes in elder care and estate management. My security team easily traced the retainer payment, funded by my father's sale of my mother's remaining jewelry. Through standard corporate surveillance of the attorney's unsecured public server, my team acquired the exact document Vance had spent the last 48 hours drafting for my family. It was a predatory, ironclad family trust agreement. Their master plan was transparent and almost comically villainous. They knew I possessed millions and a massive estate, while they were drowning under a second mortgage and maxed-out credit cards. The trust document was explicitly designed to name Richard as the primary executive and financial patriarch of my estate. Embedded deep within the heavy legal jargon were clauses that would grant my father total power of attorney, giving him unrestricted legal control over my personal bank accounts, my cybersecurity firm, and the Harrington Mansion. Their strategy was simple and brutal. They planned to lure me to their home under the guise of a peaceful Thanksgiving truce. Once I was seated at the dinner table surrounded, they would spring the trap. Dion, Richard, and their shady lawyer, whom I suspected would be waiting in the wings, intended to corner me. They planned to use a combination of intense emotional coercion, deep-seated family guilt, and sheer physical intimidation to force me to sign that document. They genuinely believed I was still the fragile, compliant daughter who would cave under aggressive family pressure just to keep the peace. They thought they could legally steal my entire empire in a single evening and use my wealth to save themselves from federal prison and bankruptcy. I retrieved my heavy cream stationery, drafted a concise, polite reply accepting their invitation, and had my private security guard hand-deliver it to their doorstep. I spent Thanksgiving morning in my basement server room, reviewing the final devastating reports from my legal and financial managers in New York. Every piece of evidence was perfectly verified. The trap they had set for themselves had snapped shut, and they remained blissfully unaware. Precisely at 6 p.m. on Thursday, I exited my mansion. The neighborhood was tranquil, carrying the comforting, smoky scents of roasted turkey and firewood. My parents' house was brightly lit, projecting a hollow illusion of holiday warmth and familial unity. I walked down my driveway and crossed the street. I brought no traditional pumpkin pie, no bouquet of autumn flowers, no expensive bottle of wine. Instead, clutched firmly under my arm, I carried a thick, heavy black leather folder. Within it lay the finalized property foreclosure notices, irrefutable digital proof of Dion's federal wire fraud, and official confirmation of Britney's career obliteration. I ascended the porch steps and knocked firmly on the heavy wooden door. It swung open almost immediately. My father stood in the foyer, wearing a warm, utterly false smile, stepping aside to usher me in. He had no idea he was opening his door to his own absolute ruin. The heavy oak door closed behind me with a solid thud, sealing us inside. Richard beamed, placing a warm paternal hand on my shoulder as he guided me toward the formal dining room. The table was laden with a lavish Thanksgiving feast. A massive golden turkey sat at the center, surrounded by crystal bowls of stuffing and cranberry sauce. Yet the festive aroma couldn't mask the suffocating tension in the room. Susan hovered near the wine glasses, offering a tight, anxious smile. Dion was already seated, nervously tapping his foot against the hardwood floor. Britney sat opposite him, looking uncharacteristically smug for someone who had just publicly lost her career. And positioned at the far end of the table, occupying the seat traditionally reserved for an honored guest, was a man I had never seen in person. "Naomi," Richard announced smoothly, gesturing to the stranger. "This is Vance. He's a very close friend and a brilliant legal consultant. We invited him to join us for the holiday to discuss some exciting new avenues for our family legacy." Vance offered a slick, oily smile. He wore a cheap, poorly tailored gray suit that practically screamed desperation. I offered him a curt nod and took my designated seat at the center of the table, deliberately placing my thick black leather folder on my lap, concealed beneath the tablecloth. We didn't even reach the turkey carving. The pleasantries lasted exactly 4 minutes before Richard cleared his throat, signaling the official commencement of the ambush. The dining room fell completely silent. Richard folded his hands on the table, adopting his most authoritative, patriarchal tone. "Naomi, your mother and I have been watching you closely. You've acquired a massive amount of wealth in a very short time, and quite frankly, you're acting recklessly. You're isolating yourself. You're making impulsive real estate purchases. As the head of this family, it is my duty to step in before you destroy your own future." Right on cue, Vance unzipped his worn leather briefcase. He extracted a thick stack of legal papers bound by a blue clip and slid them smoothly across the lace tablecloth until they rested beside my empty dinner plate. "This is an irrevocable family trust," Richard declared, his voice leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "It's a legally binding agreement that transfers the management of your personal assets, your company shares, and the Harrington estate directly into my control as the primary executive. We are merging our resources. Your wealth no longer belongs solely to you, Naomi. It belongs to the family collective. We will protect your assets and distribute them appropriately to ensure Dion and Britney are taken care of. I have a pen right here. Sign it." I stared at the thick document, utterly amazed by their sheer audacity. "You want me to sign over my entire life savings and my company to you?" I asked, maintaining a dangerously calm voice. "Just because you asked nicely at Thanksgiving dinner?" That was when Britney practically leaped out of her chair. She couldn't contain her malicious excitement for another second. "It's not just about sharing, Naomi," she sneered, pointing an accusatory finger at me. "We're actually trying to save you from yourself. I know the truth about your little tech empire." Britney reached into her designer purse and slammed a crumpled, stained stack of papers onto the table. "I was so worried about your erratic behavior that I went over to your estate last night and checked your recycling bins. I found these. They're federal legal notices. Your company is being sued for massive data breaches, and the government is preparing to freeze all of your personal bank accounts." She puffed out her chest, looking incredibly proud of her fabricated detective work. "You're going to lose everything anyway, Naomi. But if you sign that trust document right now, Vance can legally shield your money under Dad's name before the federal investigators seize it. We're offering you a lifeline. You should be thanking us on your knees." I looked down at the crumpled papers she had supposedly rescued from my trash. I recognized the letterhead immediately. It was a generic, poorly photoshopped legal template she had likely downloaded from the internet that morning. My estate did not even use standard recycling bins. I utilized a secure industrial shredding service for all physical documents. The entire story was a pathetic, desperate lie. They had planted fake evidence to terrify me into signing away my fortune. Vance tapped his cheap pen against the table. "I highly advise you to sign, Miss Naomi," he stated. "Once the federal government freezes your accounts, you'll be left with absolutely nothing. This trust is your only legal protection." I looked at Vance. I looked at Britney's smug face, Dion's greedy eyes, and my father's demanding posture. They genuinely believed they had outsmarted me. They thought this ridiculous, childish ambush would secure them a multi-million-dollar payday. I did not cry. I did not panic. I did not beg for their forgiveness. Instead, I leaned back in my chair and let out a loud, genuine laugh. It was a bright, echoing sound that completely shattered the tense silence of the dining room. My parents exchanged confused, panicked glances. Britney's smug smile instantly vanished. I ignored the trust document, completely pushing it away with the back of my hand, letting it fall off the edge of the table onto the floor. Then I reached under the tablecloth, retrieved my heavy black leather folder, and placed it squarely in the center of the lace table runner. "You really should have checked your own facts, Britney," I said smoothly, unfastening the brass clasp of my folder. "Because while you were busy forging fake lawsuits to steal my money, I was busy collecting the real ones to destroy yours." The sharp click of the brass clasp on my leather folder sounded like a gunshot in the dead silence of the dining room. Every eye was locked onto my hands as I flipped the cover open. The air was thick with the scent of roasted turkey and cranberry sauce, but nobody was thinking about the holiday feast anymore. They were watching their carefully constructed illusion of control completely shatter. I pulled out the first document. It bore the heavy, embossed seal of the State Real Estate Commission. I slid it smoothly across the lace tablecloth until it stopped directly in front of Britney. "You don't need to worry about protecting my assets, Britney," I said, my voice perfectly even. "You need to worry about your own. This is a formal notification sent to your brokerage this afternoon. Your real estate license has been indefinitely suspended pending a state investigation into your fraudulent listing of the Miller property, as well as your illegal access of the MLS database." Britney stared at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. The smug, victorious grin she had worn moments before completely melted off her face, replaced by a pale, sickly mask of absolute horror. She tried to speak, to utter a word, but only a weak, gasping sigh escaped her lips. "And considering you have no income, no professional license, and a husband who is on the verge of discovering you've depleted your shared savings, I strongly recommend you find yourself a reputable divorce attorney," I concluded, dismissing her entirely with a simple statement. My attention then shifted to the other end of the table. Dion was clutching the arms of his dining chair, his knuckles stark white. He attempted to appear confident, but a glistening bead of sweat was already making its descent down his temple. I reached into my folder and retrieved a substantial stack of documents, held together by a robust black clip. The uppermost page bore the distinctive, elegant silver emblem of Apex Capital. Directly below it were the precise bank statements Dion had falsified, presented in their entirety, without redaction. I unceremoniously dropped the heavy packet onto his untouched dinner plate. Dion stared intently at the logo. His gaze flickered erratically over the doctored figures and fabricated wire transfers. "How?" he whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. "Those were uploaded to a secure, encrypted federal portal. Access is restricted to Apex Capital's managing directors." I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, and met his gaze directly. I lowered my voice by a fraction, replicating the exact authoritative tone I had employed through the voice modulation software the previous day. "Welcome to Apex Capital, Dion," I said smoothly. "We've reviewed your preliminary pitch deck." Don recoiled physically, his chair scraping harshly across the hardwood floor as he pushed himself back, his mind struggling to grasp the immense magnitude of his own foolishness. "You," he breathed, shaking his head in rapid, desperate refusal. "No, that's impossible. You're just an IT employee. I am the sole owner and de facto CEO of Apex Capital." I corrected him, my voice resonating with irrefutable authority. "You sat in my building, drank my water, and requested $10 million of my firm's money. But worse, Dion, you uploaded forged financial documents across state lines to a registered financial institution. That's not merely deceiving your family, that's federal wire fraud." My mother let out a sharp, piercing cry, her hands flying to her mouth. Richard abruptly stood, nearly upsetting the table. "Naomi!" he shouted, his face a deep purple of rage and terror. "What have you done? He's your brother. You tricked him." "I didn't trick anyone, Dad," I retorted, my voice slicing through his panic like a blade. "He stole an app design, lied about his revenue, and committed a federal crime entirely on his own initiative. I merely provided him with the means to hang himself. And the most unfortunate part is that he has dragged you both down with him." I withdrew the final document from my folder. It was the deed transfer they had executed at the notary public the previous day. "You signed away your 30-year mortgage to a man who is about to be indicted by the federal government," I stated icily, "because Dion used this house as collateral for a fraudulent investment application with my firm. My corporate legal team was legally compelled to report the discrepancy to the state authorities. His assets will be wholly frozen by Monday morning. This includes the bank accounts he drained, the sports car he rented, and the house you are currently occupying. You gave him everything, and now you have absolutely nothing." The dining room erupted into utter pandemonium. Susan collapsed into her chair, sobbing hysterically and clutching her chest. Britney stared blankly at the wall, completely catatonic. Richard gripped his hair, pacing the floor like a trapped animal. Amidst the screams and tears, I turned my gaze to Vance, the sleazy attorney, who remained frozen in his seat at the far end of the table. His cheap pen had rolled from his grasp. "You drafted a predatory family trust based on fabricated evidence and attempted to use it to extort a corporate CEO," I informed him, my tone devoid of any leniency. My security team has already forwarded the footage of this little dinner party to the State Bar Association. You have precisely 60 seconds to vacate my parents' property before I instruct my attorney to add you to the federal indictment for conspiracy to commit fraud." Vance did not hesitate. He scrambled from his chair, abandoning his leather briefcase on the floor. He practically stumbled over his own feet as he sprinted out of the dining room, yanked open the front door, and fled into the cold November night without a backward glance. I slowly stood, brushing an imaginary speck of dust from my tailored blazer. I closed my black leather folder, the brass clasp clicking shut with finality. I looked at the ruined, sobbing vestiges of the people who had spent my entire life making me feel insignificant. They had finally received precisely what they deserved. "Happy Thanksgiving?" I said quietly to the room. I turned on my heel and walked out the front door, leaving them to drown in the utter devastation they had created. My fingers were tightly wrapped around the cold brass of the doorknob, fully prepared to step out into the crisp November night and abandon them to their ruin, when my father's furious voice echoed through the hallway. He was not going to allow me to leave without a desperate attempt to regain the upper hand. "You are not walking out of here like you won, Naomi," Richard bellowed, his heavy footsteps stomping across the hardwood floor as he marched out of the dining room. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at my face. His complexion was a dangerous, mottled purple, completely consumed by a toxic blend of horror and stubborn denial. I paused, releasing my grip on the doorknob, and slowly turned to face him. "You set him up," Richard yelled, his voice echoing off the high ceilings of the foyer. "You intentionally created a fake venture capital firm solely to entrap your own brother. Dion is an innovator. He was attempting to build a legitimate business, and you manipulated the entire situation to make him appear criminal because you are a profoundly jealous, vindictive sociopath. You tricked him into uploading those documents." My mother, Susan, hurried out of the dining room to stand behind Richard. She was wiping her mascara-stained cheeks with a linen napkin, nodding vigorously in agreement. Her tears of panic had quickly reverted to her default state of arrogant self-righteousness. She desperately needed to believe I was the villain because the alternative would mean admitting she had utterly destroyed her own life. "You may have ruined his tech deal," Richard continued, puffing out his chest as he clung to his final, pathetic shred of financial security. "But your little stunt changes absolutely nothing about our actual standing. We don't need your money, Naomi. We don't need your fake investments because at the end of the day, Dion is still the sole legal owner of this estate." Richard crossed his arms, a smug, triumphant sneer fighting its way through his rage. "This house is a $2 million asset, free and clear of its original mortgage. Dion can simply leverage it, sell it, or secure a massive equity line of credit to fund his legal defense and his next business venture. We are still a wealthy, influential family, and you are still just a bitter outsider. We have this house, and there is absolutely nothing you can do to take it from us." I stared at my father, genuinely marveling at his boundless capacity for delusion. I did not argue with him in the hallway. Instead, I walked straight past him, my heels clicking sharply against the floorboards, and headed directly back into the formal dining room. Richard and Susan followed closely behind me, confident that their harsh words had somehow put me in my place. But as they stepped back into the dining room, they finally noticed Dion. He was not standing tall. He was not concurring with our father's boastful claims. Dion was slumped over in his chair, his head buried in his hands, practically hyperventilating. I walked to the center of the table and picked up my black leather folder, which I had deliberately left resting beside the untouched Thanksgiving turkey. "Dad," I said, maintaining an incredibly calm and methodical tone, like a professor addressing a particularly slow student. "Since you've suddenly become an expert on real estate assets and lines of credit, allow me to pose a simple question. Do you know what a notice of default is?" Richard frowned, his triumphant posture faltering slightly. "What are you talking about?" "A notice of default is a formal public declaration filed by a lending institution," I explained smoothly, ensuring my voice carried clearly across the hushed room. "It's the very first legal step a bank takes when a borrower has completely failed to meet the repayment terms of a secured loan. It signifies that the borrower is delinquent, the contract is breached, and the lender is commencing the legal process to seize the collateral." I opened the brass clasp of my folder one last time. "You see, Dad, your golden boy didn't just patiently sit on the deed to this house while he awaited Apex Capital's reply. He needed immediate liquid cash to pay that offshore coding farm for his stolen prototype, and he needed funds to rent that ridiculous orange Lamborghini. So, the very morning you two foolishly signed the property over to him, Dion went directly to a predatory, high-interest hard money lender." I pulled out a thick, legally stamped document from the back of the folder. He took out a massive, unregulated short-term loan against the full equity of this house, I continued relentlessly. And, because he has absolutely no income and his bank accounts are severely overdrawn, he completely missed the substantial balloon payment that was due 48 hours ago. Susan let out a choked, horrified gasp, grabbing the back of a dining chair to steady herself. Richard stared at me, his jaw hanging slack, utterly speechless. I tossed the document onto the table. It glided across the lace runner, past the silver platter holding the roasted turkey, and stopped directly in front of my father. The bold, capitalized legal heading was unmissable. Notice of default. This morning, I announced, delivering the final crushing blow. The house is officially in foreclosure. The bank owns it now, and according to the terms of the default, you have exactly 14 days to vacate the premises before the county sheriff arrives to physically remove you and change the locks. I surveyed my family, broken, utterly bankrupt, and about to be homeless for the holidays. Enjoy your Thanksgiving dinner, I whispered before finally walking out the door. I had barely reached the bottom step of the porch when the sound of shattering glass and a blood-curdling scream ripped through the quiet Thanksgiving night. I paused, the crisp autumn air cooling my face, and slowly turned back toward the open doorway. I didn't need to step back inside to witness the utter carnage unfolding in the formal dining room. The picturesque holiday illusion had violently imploded. Britney had completely lost her mind. She stood at the edge of the dining table, chest heaving, fists clenched. She had just hurled a crystal wine glass at the wall, sending sharp shards raining down onto the hardwood floor. Her eyes were locked on Dion, filled with a level of pure, unadulterated hatred I had never seen before. "You stupid, arrogant parasite!" Britney shrieked, her voice cracking under the weight of her hysteria. "You told me it was a guaranteed return. You swore on your life that the investors were lined up and ready to wire the funds. I gave you every single penny I had left. I drained my emergency savings. I emptied the joint accounts I share with my husband. He's going to divorce me, Dion. I have no job, no real estate license, and absolutely no money because of your pathetic delusions." Dion cowered in his chair, raising his arms defensively, as if expecting her to throw the Thanksgiving turkey at him next. He looked nothing like the smug visionary who had paraded around the neighborhood in a rented Lamborghini just days ago. He looked small, terrified, and utterly pathetic. "It's not my fault," Dion stammered, his voice pitching high with panic. "You don't understand how volatile the tech market is right now. It's the economy, Britney. Inflation is crushing the venture capital sector. The interest rates on that hard money loan skyrocketed overnight. It was entirely unpredictable. No founder could have survived those macroeconomic conditions. I just needed a few more weeks to pivot the business model. If Naomi had not intentionally sabotaged the Apex Capital deal, we would all be millionaires right now. It's her fault." Even as the walls of his childhood home literally collapsed around him, he was frantically pointing fingers, desperately clinging to buzzwords and fake economic excuses to avoid taking an ounce of responsibility for his own fraud. I walked back up the porch steps and stepped into the foyer. My sudden reappearance silenced their screaming match. My parents looked at me with wide, terrified eyes, wondering what further destruction I could possibly inflict upon them. "The economy didn't force you to steal a software design, Dion." My voice carried cleanly into the dining room. "And macroeconomic conditions didn't force you to take out an illegal loan against a house you don't actually own. You made those choices because you are greedy, lazy, and fundamentally incompetent. But since you're so passionate about financial markets, let's talk about how distressed debt actually works." I leaned casually against the doorframe, commanding the complete attention of the ruined family standing amidst the wreckage of their holiday dinner. "When you default on a massive, high-risk loan from a predatory lender, They don't usually want to go through the lengthy, expensive hassle of evicting you and selling the property themselves, I explained methodically, ensuring every single word sank in. Hard money lenders want liquid capital, so the moment you missed that balloon payment and the notice of default was filed, the lender immediately put your distressed debt up for sale on the secondary market. They offered the mortgage note at a steep discount to any holding company willing to take on the burden of the foreclosure process. Richard blinked, his face turning a sickly shade of gray as he slowly began to connect the dots. "What are you saying, Naomi?" "I'm saying that a private holding company swept in and purchased the delinquent debt entirely in cash just 3 hours ago," I replied, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face. "They bought the note, the liens, and the absolute legal right to collect every single penny Dion owes, including the deed to this house." Susan gripped the edge of the dining table, her knuckles white. "Who bought it?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a terrifying realization. I reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a single heavy piece of cardstock. It was the official transfer of debt ownership, completely finalized and notarized. I flicked my wrist, sending the card sailing through the air until it landed face up on the floor right at Dion's feet. "I did," I stated, my voice echoing with finality. "Through a subsidiary of my primary corporation, I purchased your debt. The bank is no longer coming after you. I am. I own the mortgage. I own the foreclosure rights. I am now this family's sole creditor, and I am not going to offer you a single day of leniency." The heavy cardstock resting on the hardwood floor acted like a detonator. The moment my words fully registered, the dining room exploded into absolute, uncontrollable chaos. Susan dropped to her knees amidst the scattered shards of crystal from the broken wine glass. She clutched her chest and began wailing loudly, her pristine holiday dress gathering dust from the floorboards as she realized her wealthy suburban life was officially over. Britney was pacing frantically back and forth, tearing at her perfect blonde hair and screaming incoherently at Dion. Dion himself remained frozen in his chair, staring blankly at the debt transfer document as if it were a venomous snake about to strike. The lavish Thanksgiving turkey sat completely untouched in the center of the table, a pathetic centerpiece to a shattered family. Richard, refusing to accept that his patriarchal authority had been completely and permanently dismantled, marched toward me. His face was a mask of desperate fury, the veins in his neck bulging against his stiff collar. "You will cancel this right now, Naomi," he demanded, slamming his fist against the doorframe. "You are my daughter, and I am telling you to tear up that note. We raised you. We put a roof over your head for 18 years. You have millions of dollars and a massive estate across the street. You do not need this house or this money. You will forgive this loan immediately. Sign the deed back over to us, and we will pretend this ugly little misunderstanding never happened. This is your family, and you are going to fix this mess." I looked at him, completely unfazed by his aggressive posturing and ridiculous demands. "I am not going to cancel a single cent, Dad," I replied, my voice steady and cold. Business is business. When Dion eagerly signed that predatory contract, he agreed to the financial terms. When you and Mom blindly signed the deed over to him to act as collateral for a fake company, you agreed to the immense risk. My holding company acquired a distressed commercial asset, and I fully intend to recoup my investment. You wanted to play in the high-stakes financial world to show off to the neighbors, and now you are experiencing the brutal consequences of making a terrible investment. You backed a complete fraud, and you lost everything. Britney stopped her frantic pacing and lunged toward me, grabbing the sleeve of my blazer. Her eyes were wide with sheer panic, her makeup smudged from her tears. "You can't do this to us, Naomi," she sobbed, completely abandoning her arrogant, untouchable facade. "We have absolutely nothing left. My bank accounts are empty. Dion is broke and facing federal charges. Mom and Dad have no savings because they gave it all to him. If you foreclose on this house, we will literally be out on the street. You have a 20,000 square foot mansion sitting entirely empty across the street. You have to let us move in. You have to help us. We are your family, and we have nowhere else to go." I slowly pulled my arm out of her desperate grip, staring at my sister as she begged for the exact same mercy she had violently denied me. I remembered standing on this very lawn, shivering in the freezing rain, watching her perfectly manicured finger point toward the street as she threw my suitcase into the mud. I remembered the smug, disgusted look on her face when she told me I was taking up space and needed to get off her property. I leaned in slightly, ensuring my voice was low, sharp, and perfectly clear. "I do not harbor beggars, Britney," I recited, echoing the exact phrase she had hurled at me with such vicious cruelty. "You made it abundantly clear that success is measured by wealth, and that those who cannot afford their own space deserve to be discarded like garbage. I am simply holding you to your own exact standards." Richard stepped in front of Britney, his face red with indignation. "You said the bank notice gave us 14 days, he growled, trying to salvage any tiny shred of leverage he thought he still possessed. "We have 2 weeks to figure this out," Richard insisted, his bluster a thin veneer over his panic. "We'll hire a lawyer. We'll fight you in court and expose your predatory tactics. You can't just throw us out onto the sidewalk tonight." I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored blazer. "That original notice was standard residential bank procedure, Dad. But as I just explained, the bank no longer owns the debt. A private commercial holding company owns it, and because the loan was secured under a commercial entity for Dion's fictional tech startup, residential grace periods no longer apply to this property." I pulled out a crisp, brightly colored legal document and pressed it directly against my father's chest, forcing him to take it. "I am not waiting 2 weeks," I stated cleanly. "That is a formal, court-approved 3-day notice to quit. You have exactly 72 hours to pack up whatever belongings you can fit into your cars and vacate my property. If anyone is still inside this house by 8 a.m. on Monday morning, I will have the county sheriff physically remove you for trespassing." The sun rose on Black Friday, casting a cold gray light over the neighborhood. The morning after Thanksgiving was usually a time for crowded shopping malls and leftover turkey sandwiches, but for the house across the street, it marked the first day of their rapid, terrifying countdown. I sat in my plush home office, sipping a hot cup of black coffee, watching my parents' driveway through the massive bay windows. The curtains of their house were drawn tight, but I didn't need to see inside to know exactly what was happening. Desperation has a very predictable routine. Britney had spent her entire adult life relying on her status and her credentials to bully her way out of difficult situations. She was a licensed real estate agent in a high-income luxury market, which meant she possessed an inflated sense of legal superiority. Despite the sheer devastation of the previous night, and despite me handing her the physical complaint from the State Real Estate Commission, Britney was firmly entrenched in a state of arrogant denial. She convinced our terrified parents that I was simply bluffing. She promised them that my 3-day eviction notice was legally unenforceable and that she could easily use her professional access to file an emergency stay of execution, trapping the property in bureaucratic limbo for months. Sitting at the dining room table, pushing aside the cold, untouched Thanksgiving turkey, Britney booted up her laptop. I knew exactly what she was attempting to do because my cybersecurity software was actively monitoring the public data requests hitting the county network from their IP address. She was trying to log into the State Department of Real Estate Expedited Legal Portal. It was a secure network reserved exclusively for active licensed brokers to file emergency injunctions and property disputes directly with a judge. She planned to submit a motion claiming that my holding company used predatory commercial tactics on a residential property, hoping a sympathetic clerk would grant them a temporary restraining order against the foreclosure. To file the motion, she needed to authenticate her identity using her state-issued broker identification number. From my monitor, I watched the digital handshake attempt in real time. Britney typed in her credentials, brimming with the false confidence that she was about to save her family and prove she was the smartest person in the room. She clicked submit. The system did not load the emergency filing forms. Instead, her screen instantly locked, flashing a massive, unyielding red banner across her browser. I had not just filed a standard grievance with the state. I had submitted an airtight, digitally verified packet of federal FC violations, proving she used her professional access to illegally mine financial data, alongside undeniable proof of her square footage fraud on the Miller property. The State Real Estate Commission doesn't take weeks to deliberate when presented with federal cybercrimes. They act immediately to protect the public. The red text on her screen delivered the absolute, crushing reality she had spent the last 24 hours trying to ignore. Her login was permanently disabled. Her license was not just under review, it was immediately and indefinitely suspended pending a criminal ethics investigation. She was legally barred from representing any client, filing any property motion, or executing any real estate transaction in the state. She could not file the emergency stay. She could not stall the foreclosure. She could not save the house. The final desperate loophole she thought she possessed had been completely sealed shut by my hand. I walked away from my computer and stepped out onto my second-floor balcony, pulling my robe tight against the crisp morning air. I only had to wait 2 minutes. The heavy oak door of my parents' house suddenly flew open, crashing violently against the exterior siding. Britney stumbled out onto the front porch, her laptop clutched tightly to her chest. She was wearing the same wrinkled designer clothes from the night before. Her hair, a wild, tangled mess. She looked completely unhinged, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic terror. She marched down the porch steps and out onto the center of the damp, manicured lawn. The reality of her situation had finally broken through her massive ego. She was entirely broke. Her husband was leaving her. Her childhood home was being seized. And now the career she had built her entire identity around was permanently, irreversibly destroyed. She had absolutely nothing left. Britney dropped her expensive laptop right onto the wet grass. She threw her head back and let out a raw, guttural scream that echoed loudly down the quiet suburban street. It was not an angry shout. It was the sound of a woman realizing her life was completely over. She fell to her knees in the damp yard, burying her face in her hands, sobbing so violently her entire body shook. Across the street, Mrs. Gable stepped out in her bathrobe to grab the morning paper. She stopped dead in her tracks, staring in absolute shock at the neighborhood golden child having a complete psychological breakdown on the front lawn. Other neighbors began opening their front doors, drawn by the hysterical screaming. I stood silently on my balcony, looking down at my sister as she wept in the cold grass, finally feeling the exact same crushing humiliation she had forced me to endure. While Britney remained collapsed on the damp grass, completely consumed by the devastating reality of her ruined career, the interior of my parents' house was descending into a different kind of chaos. From my vantage point on the second-floor balcony, I couldn't see through the drawn curtains, but I knew exactly how a cornered rat behaved. Dion was not the type to stand his ground and face the consequences of his actions. He was a coward who had spent his entire life letting our parents shield him from accountability. But Richard and Susan couldn't protect him from the federal government, and Dion knew it. Inside the house, Dion was frantically executing an incredibly sloppy escape plan. He had packed a single designer duffel bag with whatever clothes he could grab, abandoning his expensive tech equipment and his grand delusions of being a Silicon Valley visionary. He needed to flee the state immediately, but running required untraceable cash, and his bank accounts were either entirely empty or already frozen by my legal team. With Britney distracted by her public meltdown on the front lawn, Dion slipped into her childhood bedroom. He completely ignored the sounds of his sister sobbing outside. Instead, he ruthlessly raided her jewelry box. He snatched up her diamond tennis bracelets, her expensive pearl earrings, and the heavy gold necklaces she had bought during her most lucrative real estate years. He shoved thousands of dollars worth of her remaining assets into his duffel bag, stealing from the very sister he had already bankrupted simply to save his own skin. I stood peacefully on my balcony, holding my warm ceramic mug, and took a slow sip of my black coffee. The crisp morning air felt incredibly refreshing. I knew Dion was going to run. It was the only logical outcome for a man who had built his entire existence on lies and borrowed money. But what Dion completely failed to realize was that I was already 10 steps ahead of his pathetic attempt to flee. He genuinely believed that his forged financial documents were just a private matter between him and Apex Capital. He thought the worst-case scenario was simply losing the investment and dealing with a bitter family dispute over a foreclosed house. He had no idea how the real financial world operated. The very moment Dion had uploaded those fabricated bank statements and fraudulent tax returns to my secure corporate portal, my legal team had archived the data. But I didn't just keep the evidence for my own amusement. I had instructed my lead corporate counsel to meticulously package the entire digital footprint of his transaction. We compiled the forged PDFs, the metadata proving they were created on his laptop, and the server logs detailing his attempt to secure a $10 million wire transfer across state lines. On Wednesday evening, while Dion was busy parading around the neighborhood in his rented Lamborghini, my attorneys had formally submitted that undeniable evidence directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Cybercrimes Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Federal justice can sometimes be a slow, bureaucratic process, but when a billionaire CEO's legal team hands them a perfectly documented multi-million-dollar wire fraud case on a silver platter, the federal authorities act with terrifying speed. Down below, the heavy wooden side door of my parents' garage creaked open. Dion emerged, moving with frantic, jerky steps. He kept his head down, clutching his stuffed duffel bag tightly to his chest. He actively avoided looking toward the front lawn where Britney was still weeping, practically hugging the side of the house as he crept toward his rented vehicle parked in the driveway. He threw the duffel bag into the passenger seat and slid behind the steering wheel, his hands trembling violently. He thought he had outsmarted us all. He thought he could just drive across the state line, pawn Britney's jewelry for untraceable cash, and disappear into a new life, leaving our parents to face the crushing debt and the impending eviction entirely alone. He reached for the ignition. Before his fingers could even press the start button, the quiet suburban morning was violently shattered by the roar of heavy, high-performance engines. 3 massive, unmarked black SUVs turned the corner at a dangerous speed. They did not slow down to admire the neighborhood architecture. They accelerated directly toward my parents' house, swerving aggressively onto the driveway and forming an impenetrable steel barricade right behind Dion's rental car. Dion froze, his hands hovering uselessly over the steering wheel. The doors of the SUVs flew open simultaneously. A dozen federal agents wearing tactical gear and dark windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters FBI swarmed the vehicle. Their movements were swift, precise, and entirely uncompromising. "Step out of the vehicle and keep your hands where we can see them," a senior agent commanded, his voice booming with absolute terrifying authority. Dion was too paralyzed by fear to move. 2 agents did not wait for his compliance. They yanked the driver's side door open, grabbed Dion by the lapels of his wrinkled Italian suit, and dragged him out onto the concrete driveway. He hit the pavement hard, his knees scraping against the rough stone. The expensive designer duffel bag tumbled out behind him, spilling Britney's stolen diamond bracelets and gold chains directly onto the driveway for all the agents and neighbors to see. Richard and Susan burst out of the front door, their faces pale with absolute horror, screaming in pure panic as they watched their golden boy being forced face down onto the concrete. The sharp, metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing across the driveway was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I leaned against the railing of my balcony, took another sip of my coffee, and watched the federal government permanently dismantle the last remaining piece of my family's arrogant pride. Monday morning arrived with a biting, unforgiving frost that coated the manicured lawns of our affluent neighborhood in a thin layer of white. At exactly 8:00 a.m., the flashing blue and red lights of two county sheriff cruisers broke the quiet stillness of the street. The 72 hours were officially up. The 3-day notice to quit had expired, and I stood at the edge of my sprawling driveway, a steaming cup of tea in my hand, ready to watch the final act of my family's self-destruction. Two uniformed deputies stepped out of their vehicles and walked purposefully up the driveway of my childhood home. They bypassed the scattered remnants of Britney's breakdown and the faint tire marks left by the federal SUVs that had hauled Dion away just days prior. The deputies banged heavily on the front door. There was no resistance left to offer. A few minutes later, the heavy oak door opened for the very last time. My father, Richard, stepped out onto the porch. He looked like he had aged 20 years over the weekend. His shoulders were slumped, his face hollow and unshaven. Behind him came my mother, Susan, sobbing quietly into a crumpled tissue. They were not carrying matching sets of expensive designer luggage. Because their accounts were frozen and their credit lines were entirely cut off, they had been forced to pack whatever clothes and basic necessities they could carry into cheap, heavy-duty black plastic trash bags. A contracted locksmith marched up the steps right behind the deputies, immediately inserting a drill into the deadbolt. The sharp, mechanical whining sound of the lock being permanently changed echoed across the frost-covered lawns. It was the sound of absolute finality. Richard and Susan slowly made their way down the driveway, dragging their pathetic black trash bags across the concrete. They stopped at the edge of the public sidewalk, the exact spot where Dion had stood just weeks ago, puffing a cheap cigar and threatening to have me evicted. They looked completely lost. They had no money, no home, and a son sitting in a federal holding cell. When Susan looked across the street and saw me standing by my iron gates, a spark of desperate, frantic hope lit up her tear-stained face. She dropped her trash bags and hurried across the asphalt with Richard trailing closely behind her like a beaten dog. "Naomi?" Susan pleaded, her voice cracking as she reached out to grab the cold iron bars of my gate. "Please, sweetheart, you have to help us. We have absolutely nowhere to go. All of our accounts are locked. Our credit cards are declining. We cannot even afford a cheap motel room for the night." Richard stepped up beside her, his former arrogance entirely extinguished. He could not even look me in the eye. "We are so sorry, Naomi," he mumbled, his voice thick with shame. "We made a terrible mistake trusting your brother. We see that now. We were blinded by his promises, but we are your parents. You cannot just leave us out here on the street to freeze." Susan pressed her face closer to the bars, her eyes wide with begging desperation. "You have that beautiful guest house sitting entirely empty in the back of your estate, Naomi. It is fully furnished. We will not be any trouble. We will stay out of your way completely. Just let us live in the guest house until we can figure this out. Please, you have more money than you could ever spend. Show us a little mercy." I took a slow sip of my tea, letting the warm liquid soothe my throat against the freezing morning air. I looked at the two people who had brought me into this world, the people who were supposed to protect me, nurture me, and support my dreams. "Mercy," I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "That is a fascinating request coming from you, Mom. Did you show me mercy when you secretly logged into my bank account and stole my entire $8,000 college fund? The money grandfather left specifically for my education. You drained my future without a second thought, just so you could pay for Britney's extravagant Italian wedding and show off to your country club friends. Susan flinched as if I had struck her across the face. She opened her mouth to offer another pathetic excuse, but I immediately cut her off. Did you show me mercy when you stood on that porch and watched Dion throw my laptop into the mud? I demanded, my voice rising in volume, echoing sharply down the quiet street. You took my $1,000, threw me out into the freezing rain, and told me to go sleep in my car. You told me I was an underachiever. You told me I lacked ambition. You spent my entire life treating me like a burden because I didn't care about your shallow, materialistic obsession with status. Richard finally looked up, tears brimming in his eyes. We were wrong, he whispered weakly. We were so wrong. You were not just wrong, Dad, I stated coldly. You were cruel. You willfully ignored my accomplishments and enabled a fraud simply because Dion told you what you wanted to hear. You wanted a genius son and a beautiful, wealthy daughter, and you were willing to sacrifice my entire livelihood to cater to their delusions. You made your bed, and now you have to lie in it. I am not opening my gates. I am not offering you my guest house, and I am certainly not giving you a single dime of the empire I built with my own 2 hands while you were busy telling me I was worthless. I turned my back on them, ready to walk back up my long, sweeping driveway to the warmth of my mansion. You chose your golden child. Now go live in her shadow, I said coldly, looking over my shoulder one last time at their shattered, destitute faces. The metallic grinding of the locksmith's drill abruptly stopped, severing the last tie my family had to their affluent suburban life. The contractor stepped back, wiped his hands on his heavy canvas overalls, and gave a sharp nod to the 2 county deputies. The new deadbolt was firmly secured. One of the deputies peeled the backing off a large, bright orange legal notice and slapped it aggressively onto the center of the freshly painted front door. The bold black letters spelled out official foreclosure and no trespassing. It was a physical, undeniable barrier that my parents could never cross again. Richard and Susan stood frozen on the frost-covered sidewalk, the heavy black plastic trash bags resting against their legs. Richard was staring blankly at the orange sticker, his mind completely unable to process the fact that his 30 years of perceived superiority had culminated in a public eviction. Susan was weeping silently, her tears freezing on her cheeks in the biting November air. A few yards down the public sidewalk, sitting directly on the cold, hard concrete of the curb, was my sister. Britney had not come over to help our parents pack their meager belongings. She was sitting there because she had absolutely nowhere else to go. Her husband had officially locked her out of their own house late Sunday night, the very moment he discovered she had secretly drained their joint savings to fund Dion's fraudulent tech scam. She was wearing the exact same stained designer sweatpants she had been wearing during her epic meltdown on Friday. Her phone, which used to ring constantly with calls from wealthy clients and elite socialite friends, was dead and discarded on the dead grass beside her. She was entirely husbandless, permanently jobless, and completely homeless. The neighborhood golden child had finally lost her shine, reduced to a shivering figure sitting in the gutter. The spectacle on the street had drawn a massive audience. The wealthy residents of our Connecticut suburb, who thrived on exclusive gossip and maintaining pristine appearances, were standing at the edges of their manicured lawns. These were the exact same people who had eagerly attended my parents' backyard barbecue. These were the neighbors who had physically crossed the street to avoid me, whispering vicious, fabricated rumors that I was a dangerous money launderer running an illegal syndicate. Now they watched the scene unfold in absolute stunned silence. Mrs. Gable, the neighborhood association president, who had so eagerly bought into Britney's lies, was standing at the end of her driveway with her hand clamped tightly over her mouth. The local barista, who had once slammed my morning coffee on the counter in disgust, was walking her purebred dog and stopped dead in her tracks to stare at the ruined family. The truth was laid bare on the freezing pavement for the entire community to see. They had watched the federal agents drag Dion away in heavy steel handcuffs just days prior. They had seen Britney lose her mind and her real estate license. And now, they were watching the county sheriff physically lock my parents out of their home. The neighbors finally understood that the toxic criminal hazard on this street was never me. It was the deeply corrupt, manipulative family that had tried to destroy me. The silence among the onlookers was deafening and incredibly telling. There were no sympathetic murmurs. There was no one rushing forward with open arms to offer Richard and Susan a warm guest bedroom or a hot cup of coffee. The affluent community that my parents had sacrificed my college fund to impress was now looking at them like they were an absolute disease. Susan turned her tear-streaked face toward Mrs. Gable, silently pleading for someone, anyone, to intervene. Mrs. Gable simply turned her back, walked up her driveway, and shut her front door firmly. It was the ultimate crushing rejection. I had seen enough. I did not stay to watch them try to hail a cheap taxi with whatever pocket change they had left. I had spent 28 years letting their harsh opinions dictate my worth. I had spent my entire childhood shrinking myself to make them comfortable and accepting their pathetic scraps of conditional affection. That era was permanently over. I felt absolutely no guilt, no remorse, and no sadness. I only felt a profound, liberating sense of closure. I pulled my tailored cashmere coat tighter against the biting November chill. I turned away from the pathetic pile of black trash bags and the weeping remnants of my abusers. I stepped off the curb and began walking across the smooth black asphalt of the street. The sharp, rhythmic clicking of my designer heels broke the absolute silence of the neighborhood, echoing like a metronome of pure victory. I walked past the shocked neighbors and the idling sheriff cruisers. I did not look back a single time. I walked through the towering iron gates of my $12 million estate, ready to return to the massive, brilliant empire I had built entirely without them. The heavy, custom iron gates of my estate glided shut behind me with a solid, satisfying metallic clank, sealing out the chaotic spectacle on the street. As I walked up the long, perfectly swept driveway, the biting November chill seemed to lose its edge. I stepped through the grand double doors of my mansion, and the absolute pristine silence of the foyer washed over me. There were no screaming matches. There were no fabricated crises or desperate pleas for money. There was only the gentle ambient warmth of my home and the faint, reassuring hum of the enterprise servers operating flawlessly in the basement. I slipped off my tailored cashmere coat, handing it to my housekeeper, who offered a warm, silent smile before quietly disappearing down the hall. For the first time in 28 years, my shoulders completely dropped. The invisible, crushing weight of my family's constant judgment, their endless demands, and their toxic expectations had been entirely lifted. I was free. As I walked into the expansive chef's kitchen to pour myself a fresh cup of coffee, the encrypted secure phone in my blazer pocket vibrated with a priority notification. I pulled it out and unlocked the screen. It was an urgent message from my executive management team in New York. The notification detailed the finalization of a massive, multi-year contract we had been negotiating for months. A coalition of international banks had just officially adopted my cybersecurity firm's proprietary encryption software to overhaul their entire global financial infrastructure. The initial rollout was valued at over $80 million. I stared at the glowing numbers on the screen. There was a time when I would have rushed across the street to show that exact email to my parents. I would have desperately hoped that an $80 million global contract might finally prove to them that I was smart, that I was successful, and that I was worthy of the same pride they so easily showered upon Dawn and Britney. But as I stood in my beautiful, quiet kitchen, I realized I no longer felt that desperate ache for their validation. I did not need Richard to call me a visionary. I did not need Susan to brag about me to her superficial friends. The numbers on the screen were not a tool to buy their love. They were simply a reflection of my own hard work, my own intellect, and my own independent reality. I carried my warm coffee mug up the sweeping grand staircase and walked into my second-floor home office. The sky outside had rapidly darkened the crisp morning frost, giving way to heavy gray storm clouds. A freezing, relentless rain began to fall, slicking the black asphalt of the neighborhood streets. I stepped up to the massive bay window and looked out over the neighborhood one final time. The sheriff cruisers were gone. The nosy neighbors had retreated back into their warm, dry houses. The street was entirely empty except for three pathetic figures trudging slowly down the sidewalk toward the intersection. Richard, Susan, and Britney were dragging their heavy black plastic trash bags through the freezing downpour. Without Dion's rented sports car or their own repossessed vehicles, they had absolutely no way to leave the affluent suburb they had once ruled. They reached the uncovered public bus stop at the corner of the avenue. Britney was shivering violently, her ruined designer clothes soaked entirely through, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Susan was weeping openly into the freezing rain, while Richard simply stared at the gutter, utterly defeated. They were standing in the exact same freezing rain they had thrown me into just a few weeks ago. Only this time, there was no luxury black car coming to rescue them. There was no secret penthouse waiting downtown. They had sacrificed every ounce of their morality, their finances, and their family bonds in pursuit of a hollow, fake image of wealth. And the brutal reality was that they had absolutely nothing left to show for it. I watched a city bus splash heavily through a puddle as it approached their corner. I did not feel a single shred of pity. I felt the profound, unshakable certainty that karma rarely misses a deadline. I reached out and grasped the thick cord of my heavy silk blinds. I watched them shivering on the corner for one last fleeting second. Then, with a smooth, deliberate pull, I lowered the blinds completely, permanently shutting them out of my view and out of my life. I turned my back to the window and walked over to my massive mahogany desk. I sat my coffee down, pulled out my leather chair, and opened my laptop. The bright screen illuminated the quiet room, displaying the complex, beautiful code of my expanding empire. I placed my hands on the keyboard and took a deep, grounding breath. I never needed their approval. I never needed their permission to be exceptional. I just needed my peace, and I bought it entirely in cash.